I gave my assessment of some injustices on the part of the government in terms of their representation of our position on justice issues. You know how attached I am to this institution and decorum, and so I regret those remarks and I withdraw them, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to thank the Honourable Member for his apologies. Thank you. Order. Orders of the day. Resuming debate at second reading of Bill S3, an act to amend the Criminal Code, investigative hearing and recognizance with conditions. In the name of the Minister of Justice and Attorney General.
Prise de débat, the Honourable Member for Burnaby Douglas.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm pleased to have this opportunity to speak to Bill S3, an act to amend the Criminal Code, investigative hearing and recognizance with conditions. This bill raises some very important issues, fundamental questions about our justice system and our respect for civil liberties and human rights. And I believe that this legislation compromises key principles of our justice system. I want to begin with a quotation cited by Yusra Siddiqui, a representative of the Canadian Muslim Lawyers Association, when they appeared before the Senate committee which was studying this bill. They quoted Justice Binney of the Supreme Court of Canada, who said, and I quote, "The danger in the war on terrorism lies not only in the actual damage the terrorists can do to us, but what we can do to our own legal and political institutions by way of shock, anger, anticipation, opportunism, or overreaction." Mr. Speaker, I think it's important to keep this in mind. We have to remember that these provisions, and ones similar to them in many other countries, grew out of the period immediately following the September 11, 2001 attacks on New York and Washington, a period when all of us were concerned for our security and anxious and fearful. Mr. Speaker, there are two major provisions in the bill before us, one for investigative hearings and the other for preventive detention. These were part of the Anti-Terrorism Act that was passed in the period immediately following September 11, 2001. And these particular provisions sunsetted after 5 years in that original legislation. Under the terms of the Sunset Clause, the provisions of the Anti-Terrorism Act relating to investigative hearings and recognizance with conditions were set to expire on the 1st of March 2007 unless extended by a resolution passed by both Houses of Parliament. A government motion to extend the measures without amendment for 3 years was defeated in the House of Commons on the 27th of February 2007 by a vote of 159 to 124, and the provisions ceased to have any force or effect. Well, Mr. Speaker, that was the right decision, and I'm glad that this House took that decision. Now the government has reintroduced these provisions in this new legislation, and Mr. Speaker, that's the wrong decision. Both these measures fundamentally compromise key principles of our justice system. Let's consider first the provisions for investigative hearings. These provisions force someone to testify before a judge if they are suspected of having information about terrorist activity that has already occurred or that might occur. And Mr. Speaker, this provision directly compromises the right to remain silent, one of those fundamental principles of our justice system. The refusal to testify in an investigative hearing can lead to 1 year jail time. This can also reduce the right to silence for persons who are questioned by the RCMP or CSIS, in that if you are uncooperative with a police investigation, the possibility of having to go to an investigative hearing can be used to compel cooperation and compromise your right to remain silent. Mr. Speaker, not everyone who chooses to remain silent is guilty. They may have very legitimate fears and concerns about their own personal safety, for instance. Given the broad definition of terrorism in the Anti-Terrorism Act, this provision is a problem, and the definition has come in for criticism over the years as well, Mr. Speaker. Many members who support this bill and have said in the debate that these are extraordinary measures that will only be used in the most serious of circumstances. And, Mr. Speaker, I appreciate that, as RCMP Assistant Commissioner Mike McDonnell said before the Senate committee, and I quote, "First and most importantly, the RCMP recognizes that these provisions were intended for extraordinary situations, and as such, we approach them with restraint," end quote. Well, Mr. Speaker, my preference would be to not go down that road until it was proven clearly that the measures already at our disposal are not effective in dealing with the challenges of terrorism faced here in our country. Those good intentions are noble, and I believe that the commitment made by the Assistant Commissioner is sincere, but as the expression goes, the road to hell is paved with good intentions. They represent a very serious departure, and in reality, they could be used against people who are legitimately protesting or who are viewed as dissidents by our society. They could be used to harass or even imprison such people. Mr. Speaker, this provision also puts a judge in the position of having to oversee an investigation. It's not the practice of our justice system and not something that most judges have any experience with. This is a major departure since investigations in our system are undertaken by police authorities. Jason Grattle, president of the BC Civil Liberties Association, put the concern this way, and I quote, "The primary difficulty with investigative hearings is that they distort the functions of the judiciary and the Crown. In essence, the course of order-making power of the judiciary is brought to bear on an investigation. That power places prosecutors in the role of investigators, which is unlike their usual role. It also places the judiciary in the position of presiding over a criminal investigation," end quote. Mr. Speaker, the other provision, preventive detention or recognizance with conditions, is the other key important part of this bill. Again, this compromises a key principle of our justice system, that one should be charged, convicted, and sentenced in order to be jailed. This provision would allow the arrest and detention of people without ever proving any allegation against them. Could make someone subject to conditions on release, severe limitations on their personal freedom, again, even if they've never been convicted of any crime. Jailing people because we think they might do something criminal is very problematic, to say the very least, and it's easily apparent how such a measure can be easily abused. And it's similar, very similar, to the provisions of the security certificate legislation in our Immigration and Refugee Protection Act, and under that legislation, 5 men remain either in jail or subject to incredibly strict release conditions, house arrest conditions, even though they've never been convicted of any crime in Canada. Hassan Omray remains in jail at the Kingston Immigration Holding Centre, a double maximum security prison, and he's been there for almost 7 years now, ever since just immediately after September 11th, even though he's never been charged, let alone convicted of any crime. Adil Sharkawi, Mohammed Harkat, Mahmoud Jabala, Mohammed Majoub are prisoners in their own homes, guarded by their spouses and others. These situations are very unjust, and it's wrong to be included in the immigration legislation. It's wrong to include the same kind of measure in our anti-terrorism legislation. These measures open very serious files on individuals, files alleging that they have some connection to terrorism, on people who have never been, and these files are opened on people who have never been convicted of any crime. They can be based on allegations that have never been proven. And how do you defend yourselves in such circumstances? Do you defend yourself in such circumstances? Now, Mr. Speaker, we believe in this corner of the House that the criminal code is the best way to deal with issues of terrorism. The NDP Justice Critic, the MP from Windsor-Tecumseh, in his minority report on the Anti-Terrorism Act review said the following, and I quote, "There is no act of terrorism that is not already a criminal offense punishable by the most stringent penalties under the criminal code. This is obviously the case for premeditated, cold-blooded murders. However, it is also true of destruction of major infrastructures. Moreover, when judges exercise their discretion during sentencing, they will consider the terrorist motive as an aggravating factor. They will find that the potential for rehabilitation is very low, that the risk of recidivism is very high, and that deterrence and denunciation are grounds for stiffer sentencing. This is what they've always done in the past, and there is no reason to think that they will do differently in the future, end quote. I can think of no offense, Mr. Speaker, related to terrorism that is not already included in the criminal code. And I can think of no circumstance of a crime committed as a part of an act of terrorism that would not be dealt with in the strictest, toughest way by our courts. For instance, Mr. Speaker, counseling to commit murder is already an offense under the criminal code. Being party to an offense is also a crime. The crime of conspiracy is well established under the criminal code and deals with the planning of criminal activity. Let's be clear, no crime actually has to be committed in the conspiracy category for someone to be found guilty of conspiracy under the criminal code. We also have hate crime legislation that outlaws the promotion of hatred against a particular group. It should also be noted that peace bond provisions already exist in the criminal code and can be exercised when there are reasonable grounds to believe that a person's life or well-being is threatened by another person. This provision has similar power to preventive detention, but more significant safeguards are built into the criminal code provision. No one has demonstrated to my satisfaction that this existing provision will not meet the needs of dealing with terrorist activity. As Denis Barrette, spokesperson for the International Civil Liberties Monitoring Group and the Ligue des Droits et Libertés, has said, Canadians would, and I quote, Canadians would be better served and better protected if the authorities rely on the standard provisions of the criminal code. The use of arbitrary powers and the lowering of the standard of proof are no substitute for police work carried out in compliance with the rules. Indeed, these powers open the door to miscarriage of justice and the significant likelihood of damaging the reputation of individual citizens, end quote. If our police and intelligence authorities do not have the resources they need to investigate potential terrorist acts and to charge those responsible, then we should review their needs immediately. We cannot, Mr. Speaker, consider this bill without considering the question of racial and religious profiling. Racial and religious profiling is a problem in terrorism-related investigations and prosecutions. It's a reality for many Canadians, especially those in the Arab and Muslim communities, but also to other people in other racial minority groups. These provisions do nothing, the provisions of S3 do nothing to reduce such concerns or to protect Canadian citizens from such profiling. We have to struggle with the experience of Arab and Muslim communities in Canada in the post-September 11th period. Imam Ziad Delich, the National Executive Director of the Canadian Islamic Congress, and formerly the Imam of the mosque in my community, brought some of the concerns of Canadian Muslims before the Senate committee. He noted their position that the criminal code can deal fully with terrorism-related crimes and that it best balances security with human rights. He also noted that ensuring all Canadians participate fully in our society without having to be regarded with suspicion is very important. He said, and I quote, "Education, engagement, participation, and institutional integration through inclusion are better alternatives. Moving forward with good faith will create an atmosphere of trust, cooperation, and engagement we need to make progress." He also made a very direct plea at the committee when he said, and I quote, "On policies and practices, profiling Canadian Muslims is an issue on which the Government of Canada and Canadian Muslims differ significantly. Muslims cannot accept that we are profiled as a security threat to our own country. If government policy is not engaged in profiling, its actual operational practices speak differently, as evidenced by many cases in Canada. Please do not give our law and order people more power without appropriate accountability. Canada does not need laws that will prevent its citizens from feeling accepted, embraced, safe, and secure. Canada needs to rethink its approach towards this bill and to focus on bridge building between government and the many communities and groups that make us the unique mosaic we are," end quote. There is an important message, Mr. Speaker, in his statement. We must pay clear attention to the effect that legislation like Bill S3 and its extraordinary provisions have in our communities, the effect that it will have on some law-abiding, honourable Canadians. If this legislation increases their insecurity, if it does not promote their safety, how can we believe that somehow it adds to the overall protection of Canadian society? J.S. Woodsworth, the first leader of the CCF, once said, quote, "What we desire for ourselves, we wish for all," end quote. I think we'd be well advised to struggle with the meaning of that in the context of developing anti-terrorism and security measures that are experienced positively by all those Canadians who seek peace and justice, respect the law, promote values of equality, and oppose terrorism. I should point out, Mr. Speaker, that the NDP has a proposal to address racial and religious profiling in Canada in Bill C-493, which I tabled in the House. The original version of this bill was tabled by the member for Vancouver East, and after consultations with members of the Arab, Muslim, Black, Aboriginal, and South Asian communities, it was revised and retabled as Bill C-493. That bill states that enforcement officers from the RCMP, Canada Customs, Canada Revenue Agency, the Immigration Department, Canada Border Security Agency, those operating under the Aeronautics Act, or CSIS, must not engage in racial or religious profiling. Those agencies must collect data to ensure that this practice is not engaged and must put in place explicit policies and procedures to prevent it and to respond to complaints. And they must also undertake an analysis of racism and how it functions in the context of the particular agency. Mr. Speaker, racial and religious profiling is hugely detrimental to the stability and success of Canadian society. It must not be tolerated in any form. We must be explicit in our condemnation of it and ensure that it is prohibited in law. Mr. Speaker, Denis Barrette also stated at the Senate hearings on Bill S3, and I quote, "These laws are used in emergencies where fear and panic terrorism is of the most serious kinds of crime that we could have in Canada, and that they have some of the harshest penalties associated with them, that the criminal code provides for processes of long standing that balance the need to protect individual freedoms and the security and the needs of the state, and that there's been many years, centuries even, of jurisprudence to get us to that point in Canada where we have a system that balances those concerns. And I think that it's very important that we show respect for that system. I'm not convinced that extraordinary measures have been necessary. In fact, they've never been used when they did exist in that 5-year period. And it doesn't seem that they have been part of what's been necessary to protect us in the circumstances that exist in the world today. And you know, I think that we have to be vigilant about these kinds of provisions that would take us to a different place, that would suspend some of the basic rights that we have. I think if you told many Canadians that currently we have someone in jail in Canada for 7 years who's never ever been charged or convicted of a crime, they would find that unbelievable and shocking and would want to know how that was possible in Canadian society. But that's already the situation we have with the security certificate legislation and the situation of Mr. Almray, who is in the Kingston Immigration Holding Center. That's a very draconian piece of legislation that's currently being used in Canada. And despite assurances that we may have that extraordinary measures are not to be used or are only to be used in very extreme or difficult circumstances, here we have someone who's been detained for that period of time without any possibility of being released. It looks very bleak in that sense right now, given the extension of that legislation. So, Mr. Speaker, I think we have to be very vigilant about our commitment to human rights and civil liberties, to the principles of the Charter, and to make sure that we judge this legislation in that light before it comes to a vote here in the House of Commons.
Questions and comments? The honourable member for Kitchener-Conestoga.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It seems to me that the Speaker here is raising unnecessary concerns that these provisions will somehow be abused. And in fact, there are many safeguards with respect, especially to the recognizance conditions. And first of all, it should point out that the consent of the Attorney General of Canada or the Attorney General or Solicitor General for the province has to be obtained. Also, it's only if the person refuses to enter into the recognizance that they can be incarcerated. And I think that's an important point, Mr. Speaker.
Absolutely.
And also, the person that enters that recognizance has the right to apply to change or to vary the conditions under the recognizance order. So it seems to me, Mr. Speaker, that many of the concerns that he's raised are unnecessarily raising fears among Canadians that this will somehow be abused, and I would like him to respond to those questions. Thank you.
The honourable member for Burnaby Douglas.
Well, Mr. Speaker, why would we put someone in jail who's never ever been convicted of a crime in Canada, who's never had the benefit of that? And that's what this provision will do. Why would we put someone subject to very extreme limitations on their personal freedom when it's never been proven that they've committed a crime or pose any threat to Canadian society? That's the problem with this legislation. It takes all of those kinds of cases out of our usual justice system and makes an exception and says that we somehow believe that this person, we have allegations against this person and that we need to protect society from them. But we have no proof. It's never been proven in a court of law in our usual justice system that they have done something that should merit that kind of treatment, merit some restriction on their freedom. We have the possibility of doing that under the criminal code. Conspiracy is a crime under the criminal code. Plotting a criminal activity is a crime under the criminal code. We should use those provisions and subject a person to the rigors of the criminal code and subject the state to the rigors of the criminal code in those instances as well. I think that there's no excuse for short-circuiting that process. No one has been able to show that this has been necessary in the 5 years since 9/11, since September 11th. It hasn't been used in that period. We have charged people with offenses related to alleged terrorist activity, but we didn't use these kinds of provisions to do that, Mr. Speaker. I think that it's very dangerous to have this kind of sweeping provision, this kind of extraordinary provision on the books when we already have legislation in the criminal code that can deal effectively with any of the situations that might arise and that also balance the need for security and respect for human rights and civil liberties in Canada.
Resuming debate. Reprise de débat.
Resuming debate. The Honourable Member for Chalaga. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Before beginning my speech, Mr. Speaker, I'd like to say that yesterday the chief who is responsible for parliamentary interpretation, Mrs. Monique Perrin-Derloz, worked 35 years for the House of Commons and she retired yesterday. I attended the reception for her retirement. I know she was very dedicated to all parliamentarians here in this House, and I'd like to thank her for that dedication. It's rather troubling to deal with Bill S3. In order to understand S3, we have to go back to 2001 and the events that took place that September, where we've understood that there was a link between terrorism and the civil society, and the former Prime Minister Jean Chrétien deals with this at great length in his memoirs, the fact that the United States and Canada are so closely related, and John Diefenbaker, in speaking to President Kennedy, said, geography has made us neighbors and history has made us friends. So we have close ties with the United States, which can be beneficial from time to time and detrimental from time to time. And all Canadians witnessed the Twin Towers falling and understood what this meant in terms of sadness and concern for those who were involved. And Anne McClellan, who was the Minister for Public Safety at the time, acted rather precipitously. Now, we have to understand the context. No one wants to minimize what happened on September 11th, 2001, but in hindsight, we now realize that the anti-terrorism bill that was studied in a legislative committee, a special committee that examined the provisions, and if I remember, our colleague for Argenteuil, Papineau-Mirabel, represented the Bloc Québécois with the defense critic for the Bloc Québécois attended these meetings, and there was this collective anguish. There was pressure being exerted by the Americans who passed the Patriot Act. Now, I don't want to go back to that American legislation. It goes much further than Canada's legislation. But there was a collective psychosis that set in, which perhaps led us to shortchange our civil legislation. Now, we know how terrorism can affect a society. The Bloc Québécois had always been interested in organized crime, and there is a generation here in the House that had followed the work of HoC. I was young at the time, but others might remember what happened with the tainted meat and other occurrences, which helped us to understand that organized crime had tentacles that went quite far into society. And in the 1990s, there was a resurgence of organized crime, particularly in large cities like Montreal. And we understand that this led to a ferocious battle for the drug trafficking market. In my riding, a car was bombed, and Daniel Desrochers, a young child, was killed at the time, which led myself and all parliamentarians to look into the effectiveness of the criminal code to dismantle organized crime rings and networks. And now we have to go even further and tackle terrorism. Terrorism, in its contemporary manifestation, is attempting to attack civil society. And they don't differentiate. They put a bomb in a subway, so they're not targeting a particular individual, but an entire community. When you attack a public building, you aren't targeting one person. You are threatening civil society. And this is all the more serious because those who must enforce the law have a hard time investigating and dismantling terrorist rings because they're so much harder to detect than organized crime rings. Charles David wrote a book saying that what was underlying terrorism in the early beginning of this century had to do with religion. The Americans have a policy that we learned this in political sciences courses, that they wanted to be the planet's policeman, and they tend to intervene more often throughout the world. And I don't want to forget an important part here. In 2001, the Liberals brought in a bill that the Bloc Québécois did not support. There was a great deal of pressure at the time, but the Bloc Québécois didn't support the bill because we had questions about its effectiveness. We didn't want to minimize the whole possibility of a terrorist attack. We knew that it could happen, and we knew that it was important to have emergency measures and plans, and people in the security field worked hard on this, but we didn't think at the time that the measures that were brought forward were the right solution. There was a possibility to arrest people without a charge, and that is a fundamental principle of our justice system. When you want to take someone before the courts, we have a constitutional obligation to provide evidence, to charge or indict that person, and the more serious it is, the more likely they are to appear before a criminal court, and the justice system becomes involved. There is a defense attorney, a crown attorney. You provide the evidence. If it's serious, you have a jury, and then things follow from there.
The former Minister of Justice, McClellan, took some action, which with sections, and Mr. Speaker, I would remind you that recently the House, when Anne McClellan's bill was presented before the House, there was a grandfather clause. So the bill stated that after a certain period of time, a committee had to review the provisions, and we could take a second look at the whole issue. This House did not feel it was appropriate to renew the criminal code provisions pertaining to 83.19 and 83.3. So we had a vote on the issue. We voted against it, and the majority in this House felt that it was not appropriate to renew this provision. This was unanimous in the bloc, and I believe the Liberals were divided on this. The NDP was unanimous, but the Conservatives were in favor of it. So that's why we're so concerned. There is what we call the investigative hearings. So individuals are not convicted. They don't even know if they're going to be brought to trial. So this is before the whole system kicks in, and once again, we're being asked to support 83.9 of the Criminal Code. These are called investigative hearings. I will explain what this is because it's a little bit technical, and I would like the citizenry to explain and to understand what we're talking about. A peace officer, a police officer, can ask a judge from the provincial court. In Quebec, for instance, this would be the provincial court judges that issue warrants, or a superior court with the consentment of the Attorney General. Yes, that's true. This was referred to earlier. This is a matter that comes under the purview of the Attorney General. Gives us the person, gives a police officer or a peace officer the right to look for information. So if this if this police officer goes to court and says, I would like to get more information, more intelligent with respect to an individual, and I have reasons to believe that this person may be connected to a terrorist network. I will remind you, Mr. Speaker, there's no charges. We're not talking about a trial here. We're just talking about a very arbitrary measure here. So this individual, therefore, has to go before a judge. This person, let's say next Tuesday at 10 o'clock, is told that this is given a warrant telling him to present himself before a judge at 10 o'clock on a specific date. This individual has to answer the questions. The individual cannot remain silent. And there's a principle that says that you do not have to incriminate yourself. And this goes back to provisions in the criminal code. If we're talking about an individual who has protected information, let's say someone who works for CSIS, for instance, well, this person obviously is not compelled to disclose information because it's protected. And if you're a police officer, you don't have to disclose your source. So this testimony, Mr. Speaker, is carried out before a judge, and at that time the individual is compelled to answer. You can just shrug this off. I heard a Conservative member say earlier, yes, that's true. The Attorney General gets involved. Yes, the individual can be represented by a lawyer. But do we realize that we're in a situation where the individual is not even charged? So this person is subject to an integration without any formal justice mechanism being issued. And I must remind the House, Mr. Speaker, that it's a little bit like what we saw with the certificates. When the security certificates were issued, that's another issue, but it's the same logic that applies. The Minister of Immigration, just like the Minister of Justice, can sign a certificate authorizing the police to arrest a person, bring them to court, without this individual having any access to evidence, the evidence which formed the very basis for his arrest. My colleague Michel Bellemare at the time, who is now a judge in Quebec. Well, when we in the Bloc, when we saw this bill, we said this was an attack against justice, said it was in violation of liberty and freedom, and we presented arguments. And this whole issue went right up to the Supreme Court. And I believe it was in January 2006 or 2007. Well, this provision was declared ultra vires. The House was told to take a second look at the bill, but we've had problems with the review, particularly with respect to the fact that the lawyer defending the individual couldn't disclose or show his evidence to the person who's been accused. So that this made the whole process unconstitutional, and it's highly likely that these particular provisions, I'm prepared to take a bet. Usually I'm quite a careful man, but I'm prepared to bet that if this measure was to go before the Supreme Court, well, the government would lose again. Particularly, Mr. Speaker, 83.8 and 83.9 were never used. So when we voted on them, until the vote on the renewal of the grandfather clause, and the House didn't want to vote in favor of that, we've never used these provisions in 6 or 7 years. We've never used these provisions. The organizations, the enforcement in organizations never use these provisions. Why? Because the criminal code already does have provisions. So if you look at 417 of the criminal code, well, it's possible for a peace officer to bring an individual before a justice of the peace if he has reasonable grounds to believe. There has to be some basis for it, obviously. But if I believe that my neighbor, for instance, if I have reasons to think that he's going to rob a bank, well, I could go before a judge and denounce this person. And at this point, the person has to sign a peace bond saying that he will keep the peace, and so we didn't understand at that time why we had to create new legislation when in fact there was already a provision that worked. Mr. Speaker, with respect to the investigative hearings, well, these hearings enable us to get information on individuals, but these people haven't been charged. They're going to be brought before a judge. They're going to go through an interrogation. They're represented by a lawyer, but they've never been charged with anything. The second provision of the bill, of S3, and here I refer to the two clauses that were not renewed by the House, pertain to 83.3 of the Criminal Code, which deals with arrests and preventive arrests. The scenario is as follows. With the consent of the Attorney General, that's normally the Minister of Justice, a peace officer who believes that a terrorist act is going to be committed can impose a commitment with conditions, or the arrest of someone if required, to prevent a terrorist act from being committed. So this person has to go before a judge. There has to be a denunciation. This is done at the provincial court level. And if the judge is convinced that there's a basis for the denunciation, he will ask that the person appear before him, and they have to appear. This individual has to appear within the 24-hour period. At that point, the judge will decide whether the person should be arrested or be subject to certain conditions. That is, limits on the person's mobility and preventing the person from contacting certain individuals. So the difference is that formally, this individual can be arrested. The Criminal Code already has a clause, or section 810, I don't remember the exact wording, but we studied it when we looked at the first anti-gang bill. You know, Mr. Speaker, the Bloc won this battle with respect to anti-gang legislation. I remember at that time the government officials wanted to dismantle organized crime using conspiracy provisions. So there was a huge debate on this issue. There was a real organized crime industry that was terrorizing cities like Toronto and Montreal. So now we have preventive measures that force these individuals to keep the peace. For example, in the case of sexual assault, for example, we don't want the person to contact the victim. So there are preventive arrest provisions without the trial necessarily taking place. So this bill, Mr. Speaker, which is a source of concern, well, I don't believe that the Bloc will be able to support this bill, S3, and we would invite all parliamentarians to reject it. And once again, I will conclude by saying, Mr. Speaker, that the Criminal Code contains all the provisions that we need to intervene whenever necessary. Thank you. Questions and comments? The Honourable Member for Ottawa Centre.
Speaker, and I thank the member from the Bloc for his intervention. I guess the question I have is concerns that we've had on this side has been around due process. We have heard from the government and others regarding due process, suggesting that all is well, we have the right balance somehow, and the fact that we've taken a piece of legislation which we believe was riddled with problems. Nonetheless, there's enough that has been done to repair the concerns. I'm particularly concerned around due process. The provision of evidence. What happens when someone does give a statement? What happens to that? I'd just like his take on the concerns he might have as a member of Parliament, as a legislator, as to if he believes that the balance is right, and certainly heard from him in his speech about the concerns he has, but if he could elaborate on that, particularly around evidence and due process. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Hochelaga. Mr. Speaker, we don't believe that this is a well-balanced bill because, as we said, there are at least two rights that have been violated: the right to remain silent and the right to not incriminate oneself. And as soon as someone gets into the whole realm of preventive arrest, Mr. Speaker, we have to ensure that rights are inspected. We don't understand why we need these provisions, because with 875 in the Criminal Code, we have everything we need to deal with these issues. So we feel that this bill is not well balanced. As for evidence, Mr. Speaker, there has been, in Criminal Code, we have to respect certain thresholds, and we feel that the Criminal Code already has what's required. Questions and comments? The Honourable Member for Laval. Mr. Speaker, I listened carefully to my colleague. I'm very proud to see that he is very interested in this issue and he's very concerned about the rights aspect. Mr. Speaker, I know that my colleague is very young, so perhaps he won't remember that the Francophone Quebec Society was put in the accused bench in October 1970. At that point, Mr. Speaker, I was 20 years old. I was pregnant, and I was a victim and a witness of the War Measures Act, and a few individuals had committed a crime. That's what happened, but the whole society was put on trial, and hundreds of individuals were accused without any basis, without even being told why they're being charged. So I wonder if my colleague has the impression, because I know I went through this, I was traumatized for a very long time, and now we're talking about implementing provisions that will restrict rights, that can put a gag order out on people. I would like him to, I wonder if my colleague has the impression that the government is simply going ahead with its right-wing agenda with this bill. The Honourable Member for Hochelaga. I'd like to thank, Mr. Speaker, my colleague for her question. It is true, in 1970, I was 8 years old. I remember vaguely what was going on, because at 8 years of age, you do recall certain things. My parents talked about the tanks that were rolling through the city of Montreal. I remember there were artists who were targeted during these arrests. You can imagine, Mr. Speaker, in 1970, we did away with habeas corpus, so people could be arrested without any warrant, and there was no charter at that time. There was no charter, Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms. So all the excesses and abuses that my colleague described, for which she was traumatized, well, we were not able to deal with it because there were not enough legal guarantees. Now we have a charter in both Quebec and Canada. So my colleague's quite right when she draws a parallel to what happened then. There's every reason to be concerned, Mr. Speaker. Questions and comments?
L'honorable député.
The Honourable Member for Beauharnois-Salaberry. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to congratulate the eloquence of my colleague. I was elected in 2006. I must say that he is an example that really, really inspires me. He explains very succinctly all the issues that are involved, and he explains very clearly why the Bloc will not support this bill. I'm no expert in justice, but what I'm interested in trying to understand is this bill, is there a clause in this bill that could explain what happens to the individual, to the man or woman who is suspected and who is questioned and who is harmed because the community finds out about it, so this person is labeled. And in the final analysis, the suspicions, perhaps the suspicions aren't founded. What happens to this individual after this has happened? Is there something in this bill that will help this person who has been suspected of something and it has really nothing to do with it? The member, yes, thank you. I'd like to thank my colleague for her question. In preventive arrest, there will be an investigation carried out by the judge. The judge will want, but the person's not arrested per se, but the person must appear before a judge. But a combination of this bill with the security certificates will prove that this member is quite right. The person will not have access to the evidence, and the only way that the person can understand what the charges is through the cross-examination when the judge asks him questions.
Déclaration des députés.
Statements by members.
The honourable member for Cambridge.
Mr. Speaker, it's that time of year when Canadians are enjoying the excitement of the NHL playoffs. I would like to draw to the attention of the House a local hockey organization that is working to provide amateur athletic sports programs to persons with developmental disabilities. The Cambridge Ice Hounds began in September of 2006 and has grown to over 35 participants, making Cambridge the centre of one of the most successful special hockey programs in the province. As well, Mr. Speaker, congratulations go to the Galt Minor Hockey School for celebrating their 40th year of operation. Believed to be one of the oldest in Canada, it started in 1967 with an enrollment of 40 kids and has since grown to over 12,000 registrations. And finally, congratulations to our local athletes of the year at their respective universities. Anthony Maggiacomo, Wilfrid Laurier, Carly Cermak, McMaster, and Lindsay Carson, University of Guelph. Congratulations, Cambridge. Go team.
Honourable member for Vancouver Centre.
Mr. Speaker, I want to bring to the attention of the House a non-governmental organisation in my riding that, though small, does great work. Piece It Together, as the organisation is called, is run by an Israeli and a Palestinian. It began in 2004 as a summer camp, but its success is such that it now functions all year long, bringing together Israeli, Palestinian and Canadian youth in a safe environment in BC. The youth interact, build bridges of understanding and learn the skills of conflict resolution. They confront the difficult problems they face back home in the Middle East as they forge common bonds and goals. The Canadian youth act as a buffer, and they learn about the reality of hate and the solution of negotiation. The youth use film, multimedia, and dialogue as their tools. This group has no government funding. They need it urgently because there's a huge demand to expand their program. We all know that the youth of today can be the peacemakers of tomorrow, given the right help. Yet this government has refused to meet with them. What a shame.
L'honorable député.
The honourable member for Vaudreuil-Soulanges. Mr. Speaker, we were saddened to learn of the death of poet Robert Fortin on April 14th. This great Quebecer, poet, painter, and engraver had a wonderful career, especially as a poet, winning the 1996 Grand Prix at the Toronto Salon du Livre for his book Peut-il rêver celui qui s'endort dans la gueule des chiens? And in 1998, the Writers Association Award of Excellence for his book Je vais à la convocation à ma naissance. In 2006, he published his 10th volume, Les Dés de Chagrin. He was a member of the Quebec Writers' Union. Mr. Fortin was also a director at Hexagon Publishing of the poetry collection L'Appel des Mots, mainly dedicated to emerging Quebec poets. My Bloc colleagues and I extend our deepest sympathies to the family, friends, and colleagues of this great poet, Robert Fortin. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Honourable Member for Hamilton Mountain.
Since 1985, more than 12,000 Canadian firms, or the equivalent of over half our manufacturing sector, is now foreign-owned. In Hamilton, steel giants Stelco and Dofasco were sold off, as were other Canadian icons like Molson Labatt and the Montreal Canadiens. When ownership leaves Canadian hands, jobs often follow. But last week we found that it is possible to stand up for Canadian interests and stop these takeovers. We almost lost cutting-edge space technology that was designed to protect our Arctic sovereignty and monitor climate change because the previous Liberal government privatized it. But pressure from NDP MPs and average Canadians blocked the corporate buyout that would have handed vital Canadian space technology to a U.S. weapons contractor. The industry minister rejected the deal for not providing a net benefit to Canada. Unfortunately, this is the exception, not the rule. Since 1985, not a single foreign takeover was rejected, and 87% were approved without even being reviewed. It's time for real leadership. The minister has announced that he'll consider a new national security test for takeovers. But why can't he reinforce an economic security test as well? He owes it to hardworking Canadians to ensure that decent-paying jobs are not put in jeopardy by foreign takeovers.
The honourable member for Port Moody Westwood, Port Coquitlam.
Mr. Speaker, governments can and should do more to fight prostate cancer, which is the most common cancer among Canadian men. According to the Canadian Cancer Society, this year, it is estimated that almost 25,000 Canadian men will be diagnosed with prostate cancer and 4,300 men will die of it. On average, 475 men are diagnosed with prostate cancer every week. On average, 83 men die of prostate cancer every week. That's 11 men a day. The Motorcycle Ride for Dad is Canada's biggest annual motorcycle event dedicated to fighting prostate cancer through research, education, and awareness. In 19 cities across the country, from St. John's to Vancouver and all points in between, Canadians on motorbikes will raise money and awareness to help fight this terrible disease. I encourage everyone who can to visit www.motorcycleridefordad.org and join me on this ride. On behalf of Parliament, I want to thank all the volunteers, the donors, and sponsors for making this event the incredible success it has become, and we hope that 2008's ride will be the best yet.
The Honourable Member for Madawaska-Restigouche.
Mr. Speaker, it's not every day you get to celebrate your 80th birthday with someone else. But that was the case for the twins Lucien and Adrien Bossé from Saint-François, who were born on April 12, 1928. Each tells his own stories in his own way. Both love to say that because they were identical twins, they confused a lot of people. They traded places to fool their teacher and enjoyed playing tricks. The twins grew up and followed different paths, but always remained close. Lucien embarked on various careers. He worked at Nadeau & Nadeau in construction and cabinetry. He also enjoyed volunteer work in his community. Adrien had a long career as a barber before going to work at Nadeau & Nadeau. He's also involved in various community activities. As were many others, I was inspired by the amazing courage and energy of the Bossé twins. On this special and joyful occasion, the people of Madawaska-Restigouche join me in wishing Lucien and Adrien a happy birthday.
The Philippines faces serious human rights challenges, notably the ongoing extrajudicial killings and the apparent culture of impunity. Canada raised these concerns on April 11th during the Human Rights Council's Universal Periodic Review of the Philippines. Canada also encouraged the Philippines to ensure that its security forces are aware of human rights and their responsibility to protect human rights defenders. Canada encouraged that the Philippines have expressed their commitment to end extrajudicial killings through undertaking initiatives such as the Task Force USIG, the Mallow Commission, and the visit of the UN Special Rapporteur Philip Alston. We also commend the laudable role of the Supreme Court in the preservation of human rights and in the pursuit of justice. We encourage the Philippines to work at implementing the recommendations before them and to make progress on convictions. Canada supports the Philippines in implementing measures to promote and protect the human rights of all Filipinos. Merci, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Gatineau. Mr. Speaker, this year a record number of finalists from the Outaouais will be going to the Nationals at Expo Science in Montreal from April 17th to 20th. Of the 8 projects selected for the Outaouais finals, 4 projects are from students in my riding of Gatineau. Céliane Couture, Mylène Paquin, Talia Lausier, Émilie Courchaine, Emina Alik from Nicolas Gatineau School, and David Gagnon from Le Carrefour. Top prize went to the winner Emina Alik, a secondary student in science and math, for her project, The Dark Side of Cosmetics. We're very proud and congratulate these students for their success, their talent, and their contribution to this important event. The future is theirs, Mr. Speaker.
Honourable Member for Charles Woodson, James Assiniboia.
Mr. Speaker, yesterday Canada lost a great Canadian, Harold Buchwald. After completing his Masters of Law at the University of Manitoba, he went on to establish one of the preeminent law firms in the country with his namesake. He became known in Manitoba as the go-to guy for community organization and was often their savior. He was chair of the Winnipeg Symphony Orchestra and became its director emeritus. He was director of countless community organizations, including the Winnipeg Jewish Foundation. He received an honorary doctorate degree from his beloved University of Manitoba and honored by the Hebrew University. Most recently, he was involved with the Canadian Human Rights Museum and the Save the Upper Fort Garry Gate initiatives. Mr. Buchwald was inducted into the Order of Canada in 1993. He is survived by his wife, Darlene, and sons Jeffrey and Richard, daughter-in-law Tracy, and grandchildren Rachel, Serena, and Adam. Whenever a musical note is heard in Manitoba or a piece of art is appreciated, a part of Harold's soul is present.
The honourable member for Ottawa South.
Speaker, I rise today to draw attention to National Organ and Tissue Donation Awareness Week, which will begin April 20th. Next week, we'll help raise awareness of the vital importance of organ and tissue donations to help and improve and extend the lives of so many. I would also like to recognize my constituent, Emile Terrier, for arranging a donation following the loss of his beautiful, beautiful daughter, Sarah Beth. In 2006, Sarah Beth became a pioneer in Canadian organ donation. Prior to her actions, organs were not accepted from those who had died of heart-related issues. Before becoming ill, Sarah Beth had signed an organ donation card, and the Terrier family worked with hospital staff to ensure that her generous and compassionate wish to help others was granted. Filling out a donor registration form is not time-consuming, but it can change so many lives. As medical technology increases, more transplants will become possible, but more donations are desperately needed. Mr. Speaker, I encourage all Canadians to sign their donor cards.
Honourable member for Simcoe North.
Mr. Speaker, leadership means that when you make a decision, you stick to it. Leadership means having vision and a plan of how to get there. And leadership means recognizing the truth from fiction. All things, Mr. Speaker, that the Liberal Party is sorely lacking. They're out of touch with the issues that matter most to Canadians. They choose to focus on scandals that don't exist and cheap smear jobs based purely on fantasy. They just don't get it. Thankfully, our Conservative government does get it. We recognize the issues that are important to regular citizens, and we've taken concrete action. For example, continuing with our strengthening of justice legislation, just this past week we moved to toughen penalties for auto theft. We're making life more affordable for working families, and we're taking action to improve the health of Canadians. Mr. Speaker, while the opposition continues to demonstrate their lack of leadership, this government is getting the job done, Mr. Speaker.
Member for Ottawa Centre.
Mr. Speaker, I'm honoured to support the Friends of Ethiopia and join in their celebration of the Ethiopian Millennium. To mark this historic event, Friends of Ethiopia is sending some of the basic tools for self-sufficiency and independence to Ethiopia. I attended the launch of their first event when they approached the City of Ottawa to donate an ambulance. Soon, the ambulance will be sent to Ethiopia. I congratulate Friends of Ethiopia and its founder, Samuel Getachew. I wish them every success. Mr. Speaker, I wish to pay tribute as well to the Public Service Commission, which is celebrating its first centenary this year. On behalf of my honourable colleagues, I extend best wishes to all of its employees who continue to help the Public Service Commission to do its important work on behalf of Canadians. I encourage everyone to visit the Library and Archives of Canada from April 29th to May 2nd, when the library will be hosting a special historical exhibit that highlights the Public Service Commission's achievements during the past 100 years. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Member for Richmond Hill.
Mr. Speaker, while the rest of the world celebrates Earth Day on April 22nd, Canadians will be left to wonder why this government has abandoned Canada's role as an environmental leader. Earth Day 2005 was a high watermark for Canada's commitment to the environment. The leader of the official opposition was our Environment Minister. We announced the greenest budget in Canadian history. The world had asked Canada to chair the UN Conference on Climate Change later that year. How far we have fallen in the last 2 years. On Earth Day 2008, we'll be left with an Environment Minister who cavorts with known climate change deniers. Key advisors of the Prime Minister caught funding ads through the University of Calgary, claiming that global warming doesn't exist. And the government's climate change plan has been denounced by every environmentalist, scientist, and economist who studied it. So, Mr. Speaker, on Earth Day 2008, we will lament the government's appalling lack of action on the environment, but we also know that Canada has done and can do much better.
The Honourable Member for Shefford. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. On April 12th, Danielle Sauvageau and Guillaume Leblanc were inducted into the Olympic Hall of Fame, two athletes who made their mark on sports in Quebec. Guillaume Leblanc, who started speedwalking when he was only 10, was passionate about the sport. Fourth place at his first games in 1984. It was in Barcelona in 1992 that he won silver. It was the first Olympic track and field medal for a Quebec athlete in 88 years. In 2002, as head coach and director general of the Canadian women's hockey team, Danielle Sauvageau led her team to gold at the Salt Lake City Games. a first in the history of the sport. She was the first woman coach in the Quebec Junior Major League and first woman commentator on Hockey Night in Canada. On behalf of my colleagues from the Bloc Québécois, I'd like to congratulate these Quebecers and thank them for their inspiration. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Hans.
Mr. Speaker, on Monday of this week, the Conservatives launched their Stronger Justice System Week. On Tuesday and Wednesday, as part of Conservative Justice Week, the RCMP raided their party headquarters. The facts are clear. Elections Canada has ruled that the Conservatives broke Canada's election laws. The Conservatives have refused to cooperate fully with Election Canada's investigation, which has led to the unprecedented RCMP raid of Conservative headquarters. The Ontario Supreme Court issued a search warrant authorizing that raid. Conservatives deserve to know what is in that Ontario Supreme Court warrant. What are the Conservatives hiding? And why are the Conservatives so soft on Conservative crime?
Honourable Member for Brandon Souris.
Mr. Speaker, I rise today to thank the Liberal Party for their continued support of our government. In the past several months, the Liberal Party has opposed our budgets, our tackling crime packages, our environmental plans, and our immigration proposals. While the Liberals have rabidly attacked these proposals, when push comes to shove and it's time to vote your convictions, Liberals can be seen scurrying from the House, sitting on their hands and abstaining, actually voting to support our proposals, or just not showing up. The Liberal leader has threatened an election monthly since becoming the leader of the party, only to retreat and retrench. Is it any wonder Canadians have absolutely no idea where the Liberal Party stands on any issue? While our government continues to improve the lives of Canadians by standing up for them, the Liberal Party continues to ride the pine, collecting splinters.
Order. À l'ordre. Oral questions. Questions orales. L'honorable député.
Honourable Member for Etobicoke Lakeshore.
Mr. Speaker, the fundamental issue in the Conservative election spending scandal is relatively simple. They exceeded legal spending limits of a national campaign by over $1 million. They violated Canada's Elections Act. They broke the law. When will the government admit that that's why there was a search warrant? That's why there was a police raid.
Honourable Government House Leader.
Mr. Speaker, the fundamental issue at play is one of interpretation of the Act. And our interpretation of the Act is that it is entirely all right for Conservative candidates to talk about their national leader and to talk about their national policies, their party policies, in running election campaigns. The position of Elections Canada is that we cannot do that. That is the interpretation that is at stake. That's the interpretation that's at the core of the proposition that's put forward by the member for Etobicoke Lakeshore. We have gone to court to fight an interpretation. Why you need a warrant to understand how to fight an interpretation, we don't know. We've provided every document.
The Honourable Member for Etobicoke Lakeshore.
Mr. Speaker, this is a smokescreen. The federal court made it clear 2 months ago that the Conservatives were the only party guilty of wrongdoing in this matter. The government must be aware that there's some very serious punishments which result from breaches of the Election Act. I mean, they must be aware of the possibility of jail time. They must be aware that they could even be stripped of their status as a political party. Aren't these the real reasons, Mr. Speaker, why they tried so desperately to obstruct Elections Canada? The issue here is obstruction.
The Honourable Government House Leader.
You know, the member for Etobicoke Lakeshore came here with high heights as a man who they thought would be a saviour and set a new standard for discourse. He talks about obstruction. There has been not one iota. We have produced every document that Elections Canada has asked for with regard to our lawsuit initiated on this issue. We've been quite open about it. We don't understand why that search by Elections Canada was necessary, the same way we don't understand why Conservative Party candidates are treated entirely differently than Liberal Party candidates in this matter.
Honourable Member for Etobicoke Lakeshore.
Mr. Speaker, once again there's confusion. Yesterday we asked them to table in the House the search warrant, and we were told that the affidavit was sealed. The warrant and the affidavit are two separate documents, and they know that as well as we do. It's the search warrant that is important for the time being. So will they table the search warrant here and now? The Honourable Government House Leader.
I've made the same response before. We have not seen the affidavit, so obviously I can't table that. We have seen a party official saw the search warrant, but we're not in possession of that either. So I'm in no position to be able to table that. These are things that he's going to have to go to Elections Canada to ask for, and I gather from the questions they pose, they seem to know a lot more about this than we do.
The Honourable
The Honourable Member for Notre-Dame-de-Grâce-Lachine.
Yesterday, the Government House Leader refused to confirm where the Prime Minister was the morning of the RCMP raid at Conservative Party headquarters. So we'll try again. Was the Prime Minister at Conservative Party headquarters at any time on Tuesday morning, April the 17th, before or during the police raid?
The Honourable Government House Leader.
We talk about the absurdity of the questions put forward by the Liberal Party. The member for Notre-Dame-de-Grâce-Lachine, following in the footsteps of the member for Wascana, is laying out exactly that proposition. The answer is no. The Prime Minister hasn't been to party headquarters in all of 2008. I don't believe he's been there in the past 12 months.
Keep trying,
but
guys.
That doesn't stop the member for Wascana from asserting it as if it were fact. That's the problem with the Liberal Party. They stand up and say things in this House that have no basis in fact, for which they have no evidence, because the only thing they can grasp onto, absence of leader in policy, is smear and pretend scandal.
The Honourable Member for Notre-Dame-de-Grâce-Lachine. Mr. Speaker, all he had to do was say no yesterday. The Prime Minister and the leader of the Conservative Party is being asked to table a copy of the search warrant. Will he do that, and will he consent to the public disclosure of the affidavits related to the search warrant?
The member for Notre-Dame-de-Grâce didn't hear my response to the member for Etobicoke Lakeshore on that issue. I'll invite her to go review that, as I would invite her to review my comments yesterday and my questions to her about her in-and-out scheme, how she accepted money from the Liberal Party of Canada, spent it in her local campaign, exchanged an identical, exact to the penny amount of money back to the Liberal Party while claiming a rebate for her riding campaign. That's what they say is wrong. That's what she did. So if it's okay for her, why isn't it okay for us? That's the core of why we took Elections Canada to court. Why is she...
The Honourable Member for Joliette. Mr. Speaker, notwithstanding the facts brought by Elections Canada, the Prime Minister constantly repeats that the Conservative election practices are legal. And this is the same thing that he was saying when Elections Canada challenged the management of registration fees for the 2005 Party Congress. And 6 months later, the Conservative Party had to admit that they had forgotten to declare many hundreds of thousands of dollars to Elections Canada. Will the Prime Minister not admit that during the last election, yes, the Conservatives transgressed the Election Act? The Government House Leader.
Because we did not. We have followed the law on every aspect in this matter, and that's why we took Elections Canada to court, because we think we should be treated the same as everyone else. He mentions the convention fees issue. That's an interesting one, because I was president of another party, the PC Party of Canada, back in the days when Elections Canada said it was perfectly fine to make those registration fees eligible fully for contributions. And as a result, when they changed their interpretation, somebody didn't tell us. And guess what? We were the only ones they picked on.
The Honourable Member for Joliette. Mr. Speaker, the Conservatives have to stop thinking that Canadians and Quebecers are not smart enough to figure this out. If there was a raid, it's because something was being hidden from Elections Canada. We've heard their excuses all week, but they keep discrediting themselves from day to day. Before losing what scraps of credibility remain, will they not admit that they broke the law, and will they table the search warrant from Elections Canada and the RCMP, the Government House Leader?
We did not break the law. We followed the law. We don't have the warrant in our possession, so we cannot be in a position to table it. And we certainly, in this regard, have followed practices that every party has followed. Our dispute is one with Elections Canada. We have produced every single document Elections Canada has requested in this regard. We have not done anything the member suggested. We have been totally forthcoming and provided every document they've sought. That's where we stand. We are always prepared to do that and cooperate fully.
The Honourable Member for Drummond. Mr. Speaker, yesterday the Government House Leader said, and I quote, "We provided all of the documents to Elections Canada." But that's not possible because there was a search, and for a search to occur, Elections Canada had to demonstrate to a judge that it was impossible for them to obtain this information other than by using a search warrant. So they should stop misleading the House. What is the Government House Leader waiting for to table this search warrant in the House immediately? The Honourable Government House Leader.
The first thing I'd have to wait for to table would actually to be a habit. So I'm in no position to table it. Elections Canada would have to be the ones to do that, and you can go talk to them. In terms of the question of our having produced documents, we have produced every document sought. Remember, we are the ones who initiated this case against Elections Canada.
Yes,
we have put the evidence on the table. We have been open every step of the way. The issue is one of interpretation. There's never been a question of availability of documents. The issue is a legal interpretation of the law where they say our candidates can't talk about their leader and their policy. It doesn't make sense to us. It doesn't make sense why the other parties are different.
Member for Lon Rob David.
The Honourable Member for Drummond. Mr. Speaker, they should stop beating around the bush. If they didn't reveal the content of the warrant, it's because they don't want to prejudice those who are involved. But the government should tell us what is in the warrant. They must know it because the police had to show it to those who were at the offices before they could enter the premises. If they have nothing to hide, why don't they tell us what was in the warrant? The Government House Leader.
As I said, we don't have the warrant. We have never seen the affidavit, and insofar as we've seen the warrant, we understand it's about the issue that we have between Elections Canada, over which we have taken them to court. And I will review for the benefit of the honourable member what that is. Elections Canada takes the position that Conservative Party candidates at the local level cannot advertise or promote their national leader, their national campaign policies, and their national issues. We think that's absurd. We know that in the case of the Bloc Québécois, they had posters and banners all across the province in their local campaigns promoting their leader. And I can understand why perhaps the Liberal Party doesn't want to promote their leader in the next election. I can understand why they might not have any policies to put in their brochures, but we do, and we're ready to do that in the next election too.
The Honourable Member for Vancouver East. Order.
The Canadians are fed up and appalled at the litany of scandals plaguing this Conservative government. None of them have been resolved. The Quebec advisor, under investigation. The Canadian ambassador to the US, under investigation. The Chief of Staff to the Prime Minister, under investigation. The Conservative election campaign, under investigation, complete with search warrants. When is this government going to release the results of the 5 ongoing investigations into Conservative misdeeds? When are they going to release those results?
Government House Leader.
Mr. Speaker, we've been quite clear on this issue. I thought it was only the Liberal Party that liked to pursue the imaginary scandals because they didn't have a leader. They don't have any policies. The NDP actually has some policies. We think they're very, very misguided, but we actually thought they had those. I can tell you quite clearly, as we have in the past, that in the case of all these imaginary scandals, there really is nothing there other than a Liberal Party desperate to dredge up stuff to hide their own leadership problems and their own policy problems.
Honourable Member for Vancouver East.
Speaker, the Government House Leader seems to have forgotten that in the last election the Conservatives falsely promised that the years of Liberal-style corruption in government would end. They promised plain, accountable government where nothing would be happen. Well, nothing has changed. Insulting answers in the House, obstinate ministers, RCMP raids, investigations by Elections Canada, and now we get stonewalling. So I ask again, Mr. Speaker, when can we expect the release of any of the 5 ongoing investigations into the Conservative misdeeds. When are we going to get to the truth, and when will Canadians get the truth on these investigations?
Honourable Government House Leader.
What has happened in every case so far is we've gotten to the point we put the results on the table and we find out, for example, that after allegations that a cabinet minister did something inappropriate, no less than the OPP says absolutely nothing wrong was done and he's totally clear. And that's what happens every single time on every single issue. I could go through them all, but it turns out that, guess what, there's nothing there, because this is a government that's cleaner than any government before, and certainly cleaner than the government that right now has the legacy of having their executive director for Quebec arrested on charges of all that money that they took from the taxpayers for that sponsorship scandal.
The honourable member for Willowdale.
Mr. Speaker, the government House Leader continues to mislead this House. This Conservative overspending scandal was not initiated by the civil court case. The Chief Electoral Officer has determined that Conservatives blew the election spending cap, tried to hide it, and then tried to hide national party advertising expenses through 66 local campaigns. Shameful. Elections Canada has confirmed that the raid was not related to the civil lawsuit. Why does the Prime Minister insist on ordering his people to mislead Canadians? What did the search warrant say?
Honourable Government House Leader.
Mr. Speaker, it relates to the exact same question, the question of how you interpret the Elections Act and whether it is appropriate and permissible for local candidates to talk about their national leader and their national policies in their campaigns. Apparently, it's all right for the member for Notre-Dame-de-Grâce-Lachine and so many other Liberals to do that kind of approach. It's all right for all the candidates for the Liberal Party, for example, in New Brunswick, to do group regional advertising buy and pull funds and get rebates for that, but it's only the Conservative Party that can't do that. That's the unfair treatment that led us to bring this matter to court.
The honourable member for Willowdale.
Mr. Speaker, they're not answering the question. The only conclusion is that they have something to hide. And it begins with the Prime Minister. What is there in the search warrant that they're trying to hide from Canadians? The Honourable Government House Leader.
We have the same curiosity that the honourable member has. We have not seen the affidavit in support of the search warrant, and it is indeed a puzzle because we have produced every document in this interpretation dispute that Elections Canada has sought. In fact, we find the whole investigation kind of suspicious where it came from, but the Liberal Senator Campbell said yesterday in the Senate that he knew where the investigation came from. He says, this Liberal Senator, we initiated the investigation, you initiated the lawsuit. That seems awfully clear to me what he thinks about where it came from.
Honourable member for Wascana.
Mr. Speaker, the Conservative spending scandal is about one thing: national party spending limits. The Conservative Party of Canada broke the law. That's what Elections Canada is investigating with police raids and search warrants. The law puts a limit on how much any party can spend in total at the national level. The Conservatives broke that law and had to find somewhere to hide the illegal spending. Will the minister now consent to any court proceeding today or next week on unsealing the affidavit supporting the search warrant?
Honourable Government House Leader.
Mr. Speaker, we share the same curiosity because, as we said, we provided every document that Elections Canada has sought with regard to our dispute on how the election spending should be interpreted. And you know what? Elections Canada does make unduly rigid interpretations. I know that because the guy that this member for Wascana supported for the leadership, the member for Toronto Centre now, actually took Elections Canada to court too on an interpretation. And guess what? He won, and he's $50,000 richer as a result, and so is his party leader, and so is the deputy leader from Etobicoke Lakeshore.
Honourable member for Wascana.
Mr. Speaker, this Prime Minister has a personal vendetta against Elections Canada. Back in 2001, he called Election Canada jackasses. His words, not mine. Time and again, Elections Canada has blown the whistle on his right-wing schemes to violate the rules that guarantee fair and honest elections in Canada. So when he came into office, he changed the people at Elections Canada. But guess what? Those new officials believe in the law. They're the ones who raided the Prime Minister's party office. Why is this government trying to reduce Canadian election laws to tin pot standards?
Hear, hear, hear. Full government House Leader.
Apparently, that member should look to his left, look to his right, because every single one of those front benchers who ran for the leadership of his party, other than him, who never ran for the leadership of his party in the end, every single one of them benefited from the fact that they said Elections Canada doesn't know how to interpret the law, that they took Elections Canada to court. I guess they don't respect that institution either. But you know what? They won, because guess what? Elections Canada makes mistakes sometimes.
The Honourable Member for Laval. Mr. Speaker, the National Assembly of Quebec yesterday adopted unanimously the following motion: that the National Assembly indicate to Canada's Parliament that Bill C-484 should not be passed because it could cause uncertainty as to the criminalization of abortion and the legal status of the fetus. Will the government join with the National Assembly of Quebec and reject this unacceptable bill? The Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Justice.
I thank the member for her question. As we've stated many times in this House, as the Minister of Justice has stated, the government has no plan to reopen the debate on abortion.
The Honourable Member for Laval. Mr. Speaker, when will the Minister for the Status of Women dare to rise to defend women? The free vote argument doesn't apply. They could recriminalize abortion through the back door, as has been the case in more than 30 states in the United States. The religious right is delighted, even the pro-life movement is delighted. Unless they want to criminalize abortion, will the government ask the members to vote against the bill, yes or no? The Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Justice.
They just said the government has no plan to reopen the debate on abortion, but while I'm on my feet, I'd like to ask the Honourable Member, when is her party going to start standing up for justice in Canada? When is her party going to stand in favour of our bill to reduce drug offences and crack down on crime, people that sell drugs to kids in schoolyards, crack down on identity theft, and crack down on auto theft? That's what Canadians are wondering.
The Honourable Member for Hochelaga. We've just learned that not only Quebec is against the police intervention in January 2004 on the Mohawk territory of Kanesatake, but the RCMP was against it as well. Now that we know that this decision was a strictly political one made by the federal government, all the more reason to refund its part of the costs of this operation. Will the federal government take its responsibilities and refund the Quebec government for this police operation? The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Public Safety.
Mr. Speaker, well, our government will not tolerate mismanagement of Canadian taxpayers' money. And unlike the previous Liberal government, any allegation of mismanagement is a matter that our government takes seriously. That's why we launched a forensic audit. And the Minister of Public Safety expects to receive the final report in the upcoming weeks.
The Honourable Member for Hochelaga. Mr. Speaker, the Conservatives can hide behind an operation that was started by the Liberals by refusing to refund the Quebec government, but they are being accomplices of the Liberals and they are endorsing a bad decision. Now that they have an opportunity to act, will they correct the situation and provide a refund to the Quebec government? The Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Public Safety.
Well, Mr. Speaker, unlike the government under which the alleged mismanagement occurred, we will shed light on these allegations. The Minister of Public Safety does expect to receive the final report in the upcoming weeks, and the Minister of Public Safety expects that he will take an appropriate course of action once he's reviewed the independent report.
For Moncton, Riverview, Dieppe.
The Minister of Foreign Affairs is shaming Canadians. He has done nothing to help Brenda Martin, who is still in a Mexican prison. The minister did nothing to ban cluster bombs. In the only issue on which the minister decided to act, Afghanistan, he created an international incident last week. How can the Prime Minister continue to have confidence in this minister, and when will they ask him to resign? The Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Foreign Affairs.
with the Minister of Foreign Affairs. But what I would like to ask the honourable member is, when is he going to ask his leader to resign, because his leader is the one who said that he was going to invade Pakistan. So, you know.
Honourable member for Moncton, Riverview, Dieppe.
Mr. Speaker, last week the minister embarrassed Canada, just like that last response did, and put the government of Afghanistan in an impossible position. If they remove the governor of Canada, they look like they're caving into NATO pressure. If he stays, their ability to combat corruption has been seriously compromised. How many mistakes of this magnitude will it take before this incompetent Minister of Foreign Affairs is finally fired for his incompetence? How long will it take, Mr. Speaker?
Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Foreign Affairs.
Let me make it very clear that the Afghanistan is a sovereign state, and that makes its own decision about government appointments.
So is Pakistan.
Now, how about you asking your leader, why did he want to invade Pakistan, which is a sovereign country? Why would he want to invade that? Go ahead and ask your leader our next question.
The honourable member for Mississauga East, Cooksville. Order.
Mr. Speaker, a government member who was once labelled a foreign political saboteur by CNN has undermined Canada's ability to have effective dialogue with China on human rights. The member for Calgary West has compared the Beijing Olympics to Adolf Hitler's 1936 Berlin Games. He has even mused about an insurrection. Mr. Speaker, with his Foreign Affairs Minister calling for the overthrow of a governor in Kandahar and a backbencher calling for riots in Beijing, when is the Prime Minister going to put some diplomacy in his foreign affairs policy?
Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Foreign Affairs.
The comments made by the member for Calgary West are his own views and do not reflect the views of the Government of Canada. Canada has no plans to boycott the Beijing Olympics, Mr. Speaker. However, Canada has serious concerns with the human rights, and we will continue with dialogue with China on that issue. But again, let me say very clearly, Mr. Speaker, the comments of the member from Calgary West were his own views and do not reflect the views of the Government of Canada.
Honourable member for Mississauga East, Cooksville.
Mr. Speaker, maybe it's time to build a firewall around the government caucus members.
Here.
This is not the first time the member for Calgary West has helped define this government, Conservative government, on the world stage. He is also infamous for calling Nobel Peace Prize winner Nelson Mandela a communist and a terrorist. And just recently, the Foreign Affairs Minister has trashed the governor of Kandahar with allegations of corruption. Mr. Speaker, when is the Prime Minister going to rein in his foreign relations wrecking crew?
Order. The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Foreign Affairs.
Mr. Speaker, the foreign policy of this government is very clear. The Prime Minister has stated it on many occasions. We will stand for the human rights, we will stand for the rule of law, we will stand for the democracy. That are the driving forces for the foreign policy of this country, Mr. Speaker, and that is what this government will run on, and that is the record of this government. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Abbotsford.
Mr. Speaker, yesterday Canada's Supreme Court rendered its decision in two cases dealing with a two-beer defence. This defence has been used for years as a way for drunk drivers to escape responsibility for their actions. Can the Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Justice tell this House how this decision interacts with Bill C-2, our Tackling Violent Crime Act, to safeguard Canadians against those who commit serious and violent crimes?
Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Justice.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I thank the member for his interest in justice issues and making Canada a safer place for all Canadians. Obviously, our government welcomes this decision. I'm pleased to say that the portion of the Tackling Violent Crime Act dealing with impaired driving will come into force on July 2nd, 2008. The new law will strengthen investigation, enforcement, and prosecution in cases of alcohol or drug-impaired driving. We're taking a practical approach to criminal justice, Mr. Speaker, one that's tough but fair. We're eliminating inappropriate technicalities and finally giving victims a voice.
For Hamilton Mountain.
We all know that hard-working families are paying too much at the pump. It's not complex. The big oil and gas companies are gouging. The Competition Bureau claims they can't figure it out, even after countless investigations. Yet gas prices spike just before a weekend and when the weather gets nicer. There is a fairer way. Appoint an ombudsman, hand the office the power to regulate, and make sure the law has teeth. When will this government stop standing up for the oil companies and start standing up for consumers?
The Honourable Minister of National Revenue.
Mr. Speaker, this government has been standing up for Canadians ever since we got elected. We've had 3 budgets, 3 very successful budgets, over $200 billion of tax cuts. GST has gone from 7% to 5%. Corporate income tax is down, personal income tax is down. We're doing a lot for Canadians.
Honourable Member for Hamilton Mountain.
It's bad enough that Canadians are getting hosed at the pumps, but now they're getting hosed by this government. Consumers aren't looking for rhetoric, they're looking for help. Last weekend I spoke to a hard-working Hamilton dad who was forced to pull his son from soccer because even for one of the most affordable sports, the out-of-town tournaments come with a hefty gas bill. That is not a choice any working family should have to make. Why won't this government show real leadership and legislate an oil and gas ombudsman?
The Honourable Minister of National Revenue.
Mr. Speaker, we have shown real leadership. We have a sports credit for parents who have their children playing sports. But let me say that it is the height of hypocrisy for the NDP to be talking about the price of gasoline. The NDP stand for carbon taxes. They have advocated putting carbon taxes on top of our current price. And if their policy and the policy of the official opposition was implemented, gas would go up another 25 cents.
Overnight. For Labrador.
Mr. Speaker, the government's record of broken promises led to yesterday's launch of a second day of action by Canada's Aboriginal peoples. Promises such as the one the Prime Minister made to former students of Illacross, not once but twice, that they would be included in the residential schools agreement. Promises such as the campaign commitment that they would put the wheels back on the Kelowna Accord. Why won't the Minister live up to the promises his government has made? Or is it that they just say anything to get a vote?
They're intolerant, that's why.
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Indian Affairs and Northern Development.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I appreciate the question from the member for Labrador. In fact, I have to commend him for his recent trip to take part in the sealing industry's hunt off the East Coast. I must admit, it is appreciated that there are some members over there that support that industry. Mr. Speaker, in relation to comments recently made in relation to the upcoming day of protest, I note that when the National Chief was before committee this week, he had a lot of good things to say about our government. So I look forward to maybe addressing that in my next question.
The Honourable Member for Labrador.
Mr. Speaker, there are more empty promises. Let's look at the broken promises to Labrador. Not once, but twice. Where are the military commitments to 5-Wing Goose Bay? Where are the 650 troops? Where is the UAV squadron? I ask, is that Conservative government going to meet even one of their commitments?
Not likely.
Or, again, will they just say anything to get a vote?
East Coast.
Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of National Defence.
Well, Mr. Speaker, this government has made more commitments to the Canadian Forces and rebuilding of Canada's place in the world than any government in recent history, in decades. You know, we've set a lot of priorities, and they include 5-Wing Goose Bay, as they include all parts of the Canadian Forces. In fact, our priorities are logical. They're being funded. It's going to take a long time to get over the decade of darkness, Mr. Speaker, but we're doing it. We've got priorities that are set. Unlike the party opposite, had more priorities than Disney had Dalmatians, Mr. Speaker.
Honourable Member for Cape Breton Canso.
Mr. Speaker, this Conservative government believes that everyone's out to get them. Elections Canada, the Nuclear Safety Commission, the Canadian Wheat Board. Why, Mr. Speaker, there's even an audio tape of a senior Conservative admitting the party tried to bribe Chuck Cadman. So I guess the Prime Minister's out to get them too. What did the Prime Minister mean when he said they offered to replace financial considerations that Chuck Cadman might lose due to an election?
Oh, yeah. The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Public Works.
0 points for originality, 100 points for consistency, Mr. Speaker. I've answered this question a number of times, Mr. Speaker. The only offer that was made to Chuck Cadman was that of rejoining the Conservative Party, presenting himself as a candidate, and getting re-elected as a Conservative Member of Parliament. That was the only offer that was made to Chuck Cadman.
Honourable Member for Cape Breton Cancel.
Well, Mr. Just to correct the Parliamentary Secretary, he's been asked this question over 150 times, and not once has he provided the answer. Mr. Speaker, this Chuck Cadman affair has ruined the reputations of Doug Finlay, ruined the reputation of Ian Brodie, and I'm concerned about my friend, the Parliamentary Secretary, how it's sacrificing his credibility in this House, Mr. Speaker. The Prime Minister is on tape. Donna Cadman is on record. Has the Parliamentary Secretary asked the Prime Minister directly, explain the tape?
Don't take the bullet.
Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Public Works. Order.
One at a time. I appreciate the question and concern from my friend from Cape Breton, Mr. Speaker. And, you know, he forgets that, of course, Donna Cadman has said she believes the Prime Minister, says the Prime Minister is telling the truth. And, Mr. Speaker, we've been clear about the only offer that was made to Chuck Cadman, which was the one that I just described, Mr. Speaker. And that's the simple fact of this case. Of course, I rest sleep at night knowing I'm not sacrificing myself to anything but simply the truth.
The Honourable Member for Beauharnois, Salaberry. Mr. Speaker, the World Bank is asking all governments to intervene to avoid the food crisis from getting worse. 100 million people will be hit in poor countries. The President is asking the international community to quickly provide aid to the World Food Bank program of the UN. He needs this by the end of the month. France has just doubled its food aid to the poorest countries. Will the government answer the call to support these countries that are in serious need of food? The Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Foreign Affairs.
For food aid and the rising cost of food. In fact, Mr. Speaker, the Minister of International Cooperation just had a meeting in Japan in talking with her counterparts on how to address that issue. But I would like to remind the member that Canada is the second largest contributor to the World Food Bank, and we will continue doing that, Mr. Speaker, to ensure that, Mr. Speaker. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Beauharnois, Salaberry. With respect to the food crisis that's occurring in many countries, we were told that the government will discuss this matter during a conference that will be held over the next few months. Will the minister responsible for the Francophonie Summit take the initiative and put this important item on the agenda of the Francophonie Summit? The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Foreign Affairs.
Important issue, and it is already on the international agenda by this government. The Minister of International Cooperation just talked about it down in Japan with the G8 development ministers, and we will continue working with our counterparts around the world to ensure that this crisis in food aid will carry on. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for St. Boniface.
His attempt to breach the Privacy Act, the Minister of Agriculture gave a ridiculous response. The fact is, he tried to break the law twice by writing letters to the President and CEO of the Canadian Wheat Board, asking for the names, addresses, and specific commercial information about individual producers. Why did the Minister of Agriculture put in a second request to receive personal information after being warned the first time that he would be breaking the law?
No, say it's not so.
Honourable Secretary of State.
Mr. Speaker, the Minister was clear this week. He acted within his powers, and instead of creating diversion here, this member should follow the wish of the farmers to bring change to the wheat board, as we do here as government. And for once, he should stand up in this House and vote once in a while.
The Honourable Member for Kitchener-Conestoga.
Mr. Speaker, today the RCMP arrested Benoit Corbeil, the former Director General of the Quebec wing of the Liberal Party of Canada. He will face charges including fraud, exercise of influence, and conspiracy to defraud as a result of the investigation into Liberal sponsorship scandal. Canadians rejected this kind of corruption by voting in the Conservative Party in the last election. Can the government say what it's done to clean up this kind of corruption? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable parliamentary secretary.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. We have introduced the toughest anti-corruption law in Canadian history. And that corruption law has brought in whistleblower protection, expanded access to information, banned big money from the political process. And now I would like to take the opportunity to invite the Liberal House Leader to stand in his place and issue a formal apology to all Canadians for the massive criminal conspiracy known as the Liberal sponsorship scandal. Thank you.
The honourable member for Windsor West.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, despite years of delay, we are finally getting down to selecting a new border crossing in Windsor. The government has 3 proposals on the table to cross the Detroit River. One of those proposals will require bulldozing through a historic community called Old Sandwichtown, the oldest European settlement west of Montreal. Another proposal will also require bulldozing a forest next to a spring garden Annecy of significance for the environment. Will the minister reject those 2 proposals and support a crossing that protects Sandwichtown and the environment?
The Honourable Minister of Transport.
First of all, Mr. Speaker, I will do no such thing. As the honourable member knows, this process has been ongoing for a number of years now. There has been an organization that has been put in place. They've looked at different alternatives. They looked at a number of options, and as we know, Mr. Speaker, and I will repeat this in the House, this is the most important border crossing between Canada and the United States. This government, Mr. Speaker, is committed to making sure that that gateway maintain and continue to progress.
The honourable member for Windsor West.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. But it will be a cabinet decision at the end of the day, and the minister has the power to do the right thing, and we're calling upon him for my community to protect the children, to protect the environment, and to protect Sandwichtown, which is an area of historic significance, Mr. Speaker. And we don't take it lightly. This is an opportunity to do the right thing for the community. There's been a long history of bad mistakes on the border. It's time to clean it up and do it right, and this minister has to take his responsibility seriously, show some leadership, and make sure we do it right this time.
The Honourable Minister of Transport.
Mr. Speaker, this question from my colleague is somewhat premature. He knows full well, Mr. Speaker, that everything has been put in place. Every action has been taken, Mr. Speaker. Every rule and regulation will be followed, and everybody's concerns, Mr. Speaker, will be met with.
The Honourable Member for Madawaska, Restigouche. Mr. Speaker, the usefulness of the Court Challenges Program was shown with the victory of Madame Folland at the Supreme Court. The RCMP will have to be subject to the Official Languages Act, and it must provide bilingual services in Canada. Why does the government refuse to recognize that the Court Challenges Program is a useful tool to defend the minority language rights? Why don't the Conservatives want to respect the will of linguistic communities? The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary for the Minister of Official Languages. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Our government strongly supports official languages communities in a minority situation. We announced funding of $30 million, and this member and his party voted against this announcement. Thank you.
For Northumberland, Quinte West.
Mr. Speaker, when I go home to my riding, I hear from my local farmers that our Conservative government is delivering real results for Canadian farmers. I hear how we listened to industry and made changes to the Advanced Payments Program. I hear how we delivered $50 million for the cull breeding swine program. And I hear about how we delivered $600 million for the Kickstart. And the Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Agriculture speak to some of our other accomplishments of this Conservative government.
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Agriculture and Agri-Food.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Finally, a question from a member who really cares about agriculture. Mr. Speaker, this past week, the Minister of Agriculture received a standing ovation from over 250 farmers attending a dinner in my riding. Wow. Mr. Speaker, the loudest ovation of the night came when the Minister talked about the real results we have achieved for supply management. After 13 years of nothing but talk from the Liberals and the irrelevant bloc, our Conservative government is providing real results for our farmers. And, Mr. Speaker, unlike the party opposite, Canadian farmers are standing up and cheering for our actions. Thank you,
Member for Burnaby Douglas.
Mr. Speaker, Oceans Day is exactly 51 days, 16 hours, 4 minutes away. The Living Oceans Society, David Suzuki Foundation, and the Sierra Club have called for action on a Pacific North Coast Integrated Management Plan by that time. An ecosystem-based management plan that is sustainable, protects the environment, and provides for human well-being is needed. First Nations, the province, and the federal government must be directly engaged in its development. Will the government commit today to launching a formal Pacific North Coast Integrated Management Plan process by Oceans Day?
Honourable Minister of the Environment.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Let me first thank the member for the question and for his genuine concern for the environment. We're taking real action to try and address the challenges on the West Coast. One of the first announcements we did when I became Minister of the Environment is to invest $30 million in the Great Bear Rainforest, Mr. Speaker. It's one of the largest coastal temperate rainforests in the world, with the Hideaway Islands and the coast of British Columbia. We're also working, Mr. Speaker, to stop the dumping of raw sewage in the Pacific Ocean of Victoria. This is something that has been endorsed by the Liberal Environment Minister, former Liberal Environment Minister, who now sits within the Liberal caucus, and the member for Esquimalt-Wanda-Fuca. Mr. Speaker, days of dumping raw sewage into the Pacific Ocean are over under this government, Mr. Speaker.
Member for Sydney, Victoria.
Mr. Speaker, as the snow is melting across Canada and the tourism season is upon us, one thing we don't see is real action by this government to enhance this vital industry. Now, the industry has put forward concrete steps that they should be acting upon, like air access, the individual GST rebate, and the approved destination status with China. Why don't they act, and why don't they care? Hello?
The Honourable Minister, Secretary of State. Order.
I guess the honourable member didn't read our last budget, which put millions into building tourism products along the St. Lawrence and Saguenay River, which will build a new port, which will help the cruise industry in Pernertain, in Nunavut, which also put money into our border crossings to make sure that visitors will have a speedy entry into our country. Mr. Speaker, we spend $400 million a year on tourism, and that is in addition to what is spent by all the provinces and many municipalities. Tourism is doing very well in Canada, Mr.
Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Verchères Les Patriotes. Mr. Speaker, there is a conflict between Paris and Francophone countries with respect to the chain of TV5 Monde. The Swiss government says that France is going ahead with its provision to integrate France Monde, and TV5 will no longer be multilateral and represent Francophonie across the world. Will Canada agree with Switzerland and Belgium that regardless of what TV5 does, this must be an independent channel, independent from France Monde? The Honourable Minister of Transport. Mr. Speaker, the Government of Canada indeed sent a letter on April 15th addressed to all partners of TV5, and the Canadian proposal repeats the importance of maintaining the multilateral approach of TV5. This is an important tool to promote Francophonie values and culture internationally, and it must remain a common approach for the Francophonie.
Mr. Speaker, if the financial considerations, the offer the Prime Minister spoke of in the tape, was simply to secure Mr. Cadman's candidacy and not to buy his vote, how many meetings did Mr. Finlay and Mr. Flanagan have with Mr. Cadman after that crucial vote to continue efforts to secure his candidacy?
Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Public Works and Government Services.
Mr. Speaker, there was just the one meeting on May 19th, 2005, and that was the only meeting that took place on this matter. But I'd like to thank. It's good to see that the member of King's Hands is in the House of Commons today, because it saves me a trip to the clerk to ask her a question as to whether or not we have a vote in the House of Commons tonight. Now that I know he's here, I know we don't have any votes.
I'm sure the Parliamentary Secretary knows that votes on Fridays are deferred to Monday in any event. Just for fun. Tabling of documents, dépôt de documents. The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Government House Leader.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, pursuant to Standing Order 36.8, I have the honour to table in both official languages the government's responses to 7 petitions.
Dépôt de documents.
Tabling of documents.
Introduction of government bills. Déclaration de ministre.
Statements by ministers.
Reports from interparliamentary delegations.
Presenting reports from committees.
Honourable Member for Crowfoot.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I have the honour to present in both official languages the 5th report of the Standing Committee on Foreign Affairs and International Development in support of the Minister of Industry of Canada's decision concerning RadarSat 2.
The Honourable Member for Ottawa South.
Mr. Speaker, I have the honour to present in both official languages the 4th report of the Standing Committee on Environment and Sustainable Development relative to RadarSat 2.
Mr. Speaker, I have the honour to present in both official languages the 2nd report of the Standing Committee on Natural Resources in relation to the RadarSat 2 satellite.
The Honourable Member for Sarnia-Lambton.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I have the honour to present in both official languages the 9th report of the Standing Committee on the Status of Women in relation to gender budgets. Thank you.
Présentation du rapport de commission.
Presenting reports from committees.
Of private members' bills.
First reading of Senate public bills.
Du Sénat. Motions. Présentation.
Presenting petitions.
Member for Hamilton Mountain.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I'm pleased to table another petition today that arises out of my national campaign to fight for fairness for ordinary Canadians, and in particular for seniors who were shortchanged by their government as a result of an error in calculating the rate of inflation. The government has acknowledged the mistake made by Statistics Canada, but is refusing to take any remedial action. The petitioners call upon Parliament to take full responsibility for this error, which negatively impacted their incomes from 2001 to 2006, and take the required steps to repay every Canadian who has been shortchanged by a government program because of the miscalculation of the CPI. The petitions are signed by hundreds of people from Duncan, Ladysmith, Vancouver, Gravenhurst, Bracebridge, Huntsville, Berks Falls, Hamilton, Thessalon, Sault Ste. Marie, Whitby, Toronto, Sackville, and Bedford. All the petitioners asking for is a little bit of fairness from their government. It's a privilege to table this petition on their behalf.
Presentation of petitions. The Honourable Member for Crowfoot.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I have the honour to present a petition signed by almost 75 of my constituents from towns in my riding in Alberta, including Camrose, Armina, Kingman, and Hay Lakes. There's also other petitioners that have come from Bow Island and Brooks and Tisdale, Saskatchewan, and really across Alberta and Saskatchewan. These petitioners share our government's concern about the violence in Darfur, Sudan, and the displacement of millions of people. They are calling on our government to increase humanitarian aid and ensure access for its safe arrival. They also call on the government to treat the situation in Darfur as a genocide. I have received representation from many people in my riding in the past year concerning this matter, both from high schools and from Augustana University, and I'm very proud of my constituents for taking action to express their views. I am pleased today to present this petition on their behalf.
Well said. Well said. Presenting petitions, présentation de pétition, l'honorable député.
The Honourable Member for Ottawa Centre.
Mr. Speaker, I have 3 petitions to present today. The first petition is a petition hundreds of citizens who are asking the government to do the right thing and to locate the National Portrait Gallery in the appropriate place, and that's right here in the National Capital Region. They note that other nations have their national portrait galleries, in their capital cities, respectively, and that keeping the portrait gallery in Ottawa would save the federal government $2.5 million a year. Mr. Speaker, I have another petition from citizens who want the federal government to restore support to and stop the funding cuts to the operating budget of the Status of Women of Canada. And finally, Mr. Speaker, I have a petition from citizens who want to see the government to protect the Nahanni National Park and to protect the entire South Nahanni watershed. And they sign this from people who are from Ottawa as well as people who are from outside the Ottawa region. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Presenting petitions, présentation de pétition. questions on the order paper. The Honourable the Parliamentary Secretary to the Leader of the Government in the House of Commons and Minister for Democratic Reform.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, question Q221 will be answered today. Furthermore, Mr. Speaker, question Q218, Mr. Speaker, could be made in order for return. This return would be tabled immediately.
Is it the pleasure of the House that question Q218 be made an order for return and that it be tabled immediately? Agreed and so ordered.
And finally, Mr. Speaker, I would ask that all remaining questions be allowed to stand.
Agreed. Orders of the day.
Government orders, government bills. Senate, resuming debate at second reading of Bill S3, an act to amend the criminal code, investigative hearing and recognizance with conditions.
Reprise du débat.
Resuming debate, the Honourable Member for Argenteuil-Papineau-Mirabel. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I'm pleased, on behalf of the Bloc Québécois, to speak to Bill S3, which is an act to amend the Criminal Code, investigative hearing and recognizance with conditions. It's important for people watching to understand that the Bloc Québécois is opposed to Bill S3 in principle. The Bloc Québécois has analyzed this bill and analyzes all bills affecting terrorism with a view to striking the balance between security and respect for fundamental freedoms. The bill calls for a review, and in December 2004, the Bloc listened to witnesses, read the briefs, asked experts questions, and when the specific study of the two provisions in Bill S3 was conducted by the subcommittee, the Bloc Québécois made its position clear when it came to investigative hearings and recognizances. The Bloc felt that the process had to be better defined. It's an exceptional process that should only be used in specific cases where it's needed to prevent activities that entail imminent risk. We were firmly opposed to Section 83.3, which was preventive arrest with conditions, with a recognizance with conditions. We felt that this would be quite pointless in fighting terrorism, and the use of this provision was a definite danger to Canadians. We feel that the provision is dangerous, could be made, use of the normal criminal code could satisfy the need. So we recommend the repeal of this mechanism. It should be done away with. Our position hasn't changed today. The investigative hearing process should only be restored if major changes are made to it, which Bill S3 doesn't do. And preventive arrest has no place in the Canadian justice system, given the possible consequences and the fact that other provisions are already there and they're just as effective. This bill would amend the criminal code, investigative hearings and recognizances with conditions. It was introduced on October 23, 2007, and the purpose of the bill is to restore two provisions of the Anti-Terrorism Act which were repealed after they were not renewed after they were sunsetted. Mr. Speaker, I was a member of the Standing Committee on Transport in 2001 when the Anti-Terrorism Act was passed, and it provided for a 5-year review. And it was upon that review that Parliament decided to vote against. There was a vote on the Sunset Clause, February 27, 2007, and we declined to renew that clause, that Sunset Clause. So Section 8328 had to do with investigative hearings, and according to that provision, a police officer, I'm talking about the repealed provisions, the Sunset Clause. But there was a provision that dealt with investigative hearings, and a police officer could ask a judge in provincial court or in superior court, after getting consent from the Attorney General, to give an order authorizing the gathering of information. And that would require the individual, to appear before a judge and be questioned and give up anything in their possession that the judge might be interested in seeing. The person could retain a lawyer, but they would have to answer questions, and they couldn't refuse to answer any questions. The judge would have to rule on the basis of all the information, and a person couldn't decline to provide information on the basis that it would incriminate him. So there was no right to silence, but any information found could then be used later, directly or indirectly, in other prosecution, unless it was for perjury. This was not useful, and it was in fact never used. That was in the evidence, and that's further evidence that the clause in question was not needed. There's already mechanisms for questioning people, so Bill S3 would reintroduce almost identically this mechanism, 8328, which had been abolished by our vote on the sunset clause. And 83.3 of the Criminal Code had to do with the recognizance with conditions. A police officer, with the Attorney General's consent, could, if he had reasonable grounds to believe that a person might be a terrorist, could have the person arrested and released on recognizance with conditions before a court of provincial court, a judge of the provincial court. And a person who breached those conditions could then be arrested without warrant, and that arrest would be to prevent any terrorist activities. The person detained would have to appear before a judge within 24 hours, or as soon as possible thereafter. And then a hearing would be held to determine whether the person should be released or detained further, and this would have to happen within 48 hours. The judge who felt that it wasn't necessary for the person to sign a bond could release the person, but if he felt that the person should sign a bond to keep the peace and other conditions, those conditions could apply for up to 12 months. And if the judge felt it necessary, the person could be imprisoned for up to 12 months. There was no recourse, no remedy from these provisions. So this provision was introduced, 83.3, into the Criminal Code, and 5 years later, it had never been used. So that's hardly surprising, because police officers could and still can use other provisions of the Criminal Code to arrest someone on the verge of committing a criminal act. So, under the Criminal Code, a police officer can arrest a person without a warrant if the police officer has reasonable and probable grounds to believe that the person's on the verge of committing a criminal offense. So that provision existed already. So there's a reason why the police officers never had to resort to the new provision, 83.3, and that's why it was repealed in 2007. A person who's arrested under 495 of the Criminal Code, it appears before a judge, and the judge can impose the same conditions that he would have under 83.3. A judge can choose not to release a person if he feels they're a threat to the safety of Canadians. So judges and police officers already had all these powers. We didn't need 83.3. So under 495 of the Criminal Code, under that current provision, if police think someone's about to commit a terrorist act, they probably know this because of surveillance, wiretap, and what have you. So they have evidence of conspiracy or an attempt, and all they have to do is lay those charges and arrest the person. There will be a trial, and the person will be able to make full answer in defense. And if the suspicions were unwarranted or unjustified, or if there's insufficient evidence, the person will be released. It seems clear to us that this terrorist act would have been interrupted as effectively under 495 as it would have been under 83.3. But this is the provision that was most likely to lead to abuse, because a person would be labeled as a terrorist based on unreliable evidence, and the person would never be able to fully defend against that accusation. A person wouldn't be allowed to take a plane to the United States, wouldn't be able to go to a number of countries, and there's a high likelihood that the person would have trouble, would lose their job and would have trouble finding another one. Look at Maher Arar after he came back from Syria before Justice O'Connor exonerated him. That new provision might have been used in his case. Conditions might have been imposed on him, and the general public would have thought that this person was a terrorist. And this is profoundly unfair, and people want to avoid this type of injustice democratically. We're concerned about our societies these days, and it's inevitable in politics for there to, in democratic life, for there to be contact between terrorists and non-terrorists. But the planning of terrorist acts is, by its very nature, secret. As we saw in the Arar case, there was surveillance, there was associations among individuals. And when it comes to imposing conditions, all the judge had to be convinced of was that under the circumstances, the police officers had grounds.
In other words, the apprehension of a possible terrorist act was enough, even though the person who is arrested is not the person who may commit the act, but who may in some way be involved, and that is why that person must be apprehended. This could cover people who are innocent or unaware of the fact that terrorists have asked them to help. And criminal law already had a similar procedure to what is found in 83.3. If there was a semblance in the procedure, there was a great difference in the consequences of the application of these. 8.10 provides for an appearance before a judge, but not necessarily an indictment or arrest. And the judge could release the person on good conduct and would only be imprisoned if that person refuses to accept the conditions. If the person signs the commitment and respects the undertaking, there would not be a criminal record in that provision. And 83.3 that we rejected, there's a difference in the nature and the consequences. They are very different, and there's no link with the effect to one's reputation. When we stray from fundamental principles dealing with criminal law, there's always a risk that these measures will be applied in a way that is totally different from those that were considered at the outset. In the past, a grandparent, a popular singer, and municipal authorities had been arrested at one point, and there are two clauses that would never have been used in the past. Mr. Speaker, the effect may have been that this provision could represent a danger to our citizens when it comes to dangerous terrorist activities. The criminal code as it now applies can be used. Therefore, I didn't have an opportunity, Mr. Speaker, to explain in full the two criminal code provisions, which are very close to what is found in S3. There was the power to investigate and the commitment to certain undertakings, which are similar to what has been abolished. There are certain changes. There was a redrafting of a certain number of minor points, but there were only 3 substantive amendments. The investigation procedure was amended. The former investigation mechanism distinguished between a terrorist act that had been committed or would be committed. If it hasn't yet been committed, the judge had to be convinced, including other criteria, that reasonable efforts have been made to obtain the information other than through an investigation. This requirement did not apply for offenses that had already been committed. There is now a requirement that all efforts must have been made to obtain information for the investigation. The second minor amendment limits to detention. The bill also adds when a person is detained because that person could flee or didn't appear, there would be a limit to the detention, and a study that was done in committee saying that other than besides the Attorney General, the Minister for Public Safety should make an annual report to account for the 2 provisions and indicate their opinions as to the necessity to prorogue these provisions. And this should be done before the sunset clause applies. There should be an in-depth examination either by a Senate committee, House of Commons committee, or a joint committee of the House, and or that the House would have created. And this also involves prorogation of certain provisions within a year. So not only were the Bloc Québécois comments not taken into account, but many recommendations made by Senate and House of Commons committees who seriously examined this issue were not considered. The government preferred to follow its own lead, and there should be a balance between security and the respect of other fundamental rights. Since 2001, the Bloc Québécois has been acting. I was on the Transport Committee when we adopted the anti-terrorism legislation, and we brought in the sunset clause to ensure that there would be a 5-year review. Parliament in 2007 decided to abolish those provisions because they had never been used. And now, once again, the Conservatives are not taking into account what the committees have done or recommendations that have been made by all specialists. They decided to reintroduce measures that had been abolished by Parliament in 2005. And so, Mr. Speaker, it might have been important to explain the Bloc Québécois dissenting report, the Anti-Terrorism Act, which was precipitated after the September 2001 events, indicated that there should be a 3-year review. The committee or the subcommittee examined the legislation because there would be a 5-year review. So in October 2006, the subcommittee of the Standing Committee on Public Safety tabled an interim report dealing precisely or specifically with the 2 measures at S3, and the Bloc Québécois, even though it shared some of the subcommittee's conclusions, felt that the 2 provisions should not be maintained in their current form. The Bloc Québécois had explained its rationale and provided a dissenting opinion, stating that the report was an interim report that only dealt with 2 provisions of the anti-terrorism legislation, the one relating to preventive arrest and investigative hearings, which amended parts of the criminal code, and we are aware of the historical events that led to the adoption of this legislation. We subscribe to most of the recommendations made in the majority report that dealt with investigation. We feel that these should only be used in specific cases where it would be necessary to prevent activities where there is an imminent risk of serious harm, and not in dealing with something that has already been done. And we and other members of the committee felt that a review of the provisions 10 years after their implementation would be appropriate. to deal with the relevance of the renewal or the removal of these provisions. We are ready to accept the opinion of the majority. However, we aren't of the same opinion as the committee as to preventive arrest under 83.3 of the Criminal Code, as was introduced by the anti-terrorism legislation, and this is why you can't fight terrorism through laws, but through combined work of the appropriate police forces. There are already criminal offenses that relate to terrorism with very serious sanctions, not only for the taking of a life, but the destruction of infrastructures, and the motivation of the terrorists are aggravating criteria. We realize that what terrorists do is serious. That's always been the opinion in the past, and we have no reason to believe that judges would change their opinion in the future. This is what the members at the subcommittee said, and Parliament must understand that the Bloc Québécois will be against S3, the reintroduction of measures that had already been abolished by the House in 2007, Mr. Speaker, and the Bloc Québécois has an advantage over other parties in the House because we are always responsible and logical with ourselves. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
For Winnipeg Centre.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you to my colleague from Argent-Touy-Papagno-Mirabel. I don't disagree with his closing remark that he always comes to the House well prepared and with a very informative and well-researched speech on the concerns he has on Bill S3. We have many of the same apprehensions about this bill. I was particularly interested in 2 points my colleague raised that I'd like him to comment on. First of all, the lack of respect shown to the will of Parliament and to the voice of committees when, in fact, Parliament and the Standing Committee at the 5-year review rejected the implementation of these terms and conditions and wanted them to cease. We believe that the voice of Parliament should have primacy and that the government of the day should have listened and taken note and acted accordingly, not to reintroduce these same measures through an unelected chamber like the Senate. The second thing I'd like him to comment on is what I believe to be one of the basic fundamental tenets of our judicial system is the right to remain silent when accused or in a hearing or in a courtroom setting. We only suspend the right to remain silent with very robust corresponding measures, such as in the case of a parliamentary committee, you do not have the right to remain silent, but the information gleaned at that committee cannot be used against you in any subsequent proceeding. That does not seem to be the case in Bill S3. You have no right to remain silent, and the information you give can't be used directly against you, but it may be used as derivative testimony or derivative evidence in some further proceeding. So would my colleague agree this has to be addressed? The right to remain silent cannot be compromised unless there are corresponding protections introduced.
The Honourable Member for Argenteuil-Papineau-Mirabel. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to thank my colleague for his 2 questions. First, with respect to the first question, it's obvious that the Conservatives are acting in bad faith. The anti-terrorism bill that was passed at the time provided for a review. And why is that? Why did we defend this? It's because we didn't want to see any abuse. At the time, it was said that the Criminal Code had the necessary provisions to do the job. 5 years later, we realized that those clauses had never been used. So it was so well done that Parliament felt on February 27, 2007, that it was not necessary to renew those clauses, and those 2 provisions were abolished, and then the Conservatives, through the Senate, decided to reintroduce these clauses, and This shows a lack of respect. It's the conservative way to govern. We're right, everyone else is wrong, and that is very harmful in a society. And this leads me to the second question, the right to remain silent. You know, the provisions of the Criminal Code were adopted by those who came before us, who gave us the opportunity to be here in the House today. It's a societal system that's recognized throughout the world. It's something that Quebec would choose if it were to become a country, and that is to guarantee that every individual will not be found guilty for something that he or she did not do. And this is an attempt to change the way in which our society has been created, once again because the Conservatives felt that there was a terrorism threat, but 5 years later, 6 years later, 7 years later, there has never been use made of these sections, so we don't see why we would reintroduce provisions that Parliament has already abolished because they had never been used. Questions and comments? The Honourable Member for Hochelaga. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This gives me an opportunity to question my colleague, and I'm very pleased to do so because of his excellent speech. I think in 2002, he sat with our defense critic on the parliamentary committee, if I'm not mistaken, and as of 2002, when Anne McClellan was the Minister of Public Safety, the Bloc Québécois expressed concerns about the bill because it violated certain constitutional guarantees. Can he remind us of these constitutional guarantees? He said the right to remain silent, but is the presumption of innocence and the right not to self-incriminate, are these two not also involved here? And could he also review the Criminal Code provisions, including 810, which already exists, and which contains everything we need to prevent and counter terrorism threats? And can he tell us to what extent there's been a lack of respect by the Conservatives here in the House? I can't believe that certain members and certain ministers would go along with this and not respect the will of the House. And is there one minister that he finds less democratic than the others? The Honourable Member for Argenteuil-Papineau-Mirabel. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I'd like to thank my colleague for Hochelaga for his question. He is an excellent justice critic for the Bloc Québécois. He's very effective. He is extremely thorough, not like the Minister of Transport, who often rises in this House and is unprepared, but that's his problem. And I'm delighted that the member for Hochelaga does such a wonderful job. Now, it's always very difficult to note that a government should do what we are doing when we look at 808 or 495 of the Criminal Code, and when we see that the terrorism provisions were never used by police forces because we already had these clauses, these sections in the Criminal Code, we wonder why the Conservatives persist and continue and try to reintroduce measures that were abolished by this Parliament in 2007. Is it because they think that they're right and they want to get their ideas across at all costs? They must remember that they are in a minority here, and if there were another election, they wouldn't form the government. Questions and comments? The Honourable Member for Beauharnois-Salaberry. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to congratulate my colleague for Argenteuil on his excellent speech. I have a short question for him. This morning I've been listening to the debate, and I'd like him to explain what underlies this bill, what has been said but not written. Why are the Conservatives doing their utmost to reintroduce this bill. What is underlying this? Why is this party refusing to accept the will of the House? This is of great concern to me, and I'm sure my colleague has an idea. The honourable member for Château-Papineau-Mirabel has 1 minute. I'd like to thank my colleague for her question. You know, it's probably because the Constitution protects certain rights that we have, the right to remain silent, the right to have a full and fair defense, and that is what the Conservative Party is attacking. They want to control not only policies, but also everyone's life. The Reform constantly want to reintroduce right-wing values, and this is beginning to wear thin with Quebecers and with Canadians as well, who are finally going to understand that the only way to protect their own interests is to elect to the House Social Democrat members like the Bloc Québécois who want to protect citizens' rights while fighting against those who don't respect these rights.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I'm very pleased to rise in the House today to have this opportunity to speak again, because I've spoken previously on Bill S3, and I'd like to just spend a few minutes and go back and retrace where this bill came from. I was in the House, I was a member of Parliament when this bill in its first incarnation first came forward. It was Bill C-36, anti-terrorism legislation. And, of course, it came forward after the attack on the World Trade Center towers, September 11th, 2001. And it came through the House very quickly. And I remember very, very well at that time, as a member of the NDP, getting up and speaking to the legislation. In fact, our caucus, we opposed the legislation. And we believed at that time that the path that was being taken by the then Liberal government in this massive new venture of anti-terrorism legislation was something that was not warranted. And we had grave concerns at that time about the impact that it would have on life, civil liberties, particularly on Canadians who were originally from the Middle East, were part of the Canadian Arab community, of the Muslim community, because already, of course, after September 11th, there was a shift in what was taking place in our society. Many, many things changed, and one of which, of course, was the legislation that came forward. And at that time, during the debate, and the debate was not that long. In fact, one of the concerns we had at the time, back in 2001, was how quickly the legislation was being pushed through Parliament. I mean, this was very serious legislation that made very significant departures from the process of law that we understand in this country. And I remember that we raised at the time that in particular, the two particular clauses that we're now dealing with today, 7 years later, were clauses that were particularly offensive. And because there was so much debate about those two clauses, which happened to do with investigative hearings and preventive detention, it was agreed by the government, finally, that they would be clauses that could be sunsetted. They would be clauses that would come under a review, so that, again, Parliament would have to examine the legislation and those particular clauses. And, of course, Mr. Speaker, as we know, that bill, the Anti-Terrorism Act, did pass very quickly, even though the NDP, and I'm not sure if the Bloc at that time, they might have opposed it as well, but it was basically the NDP and maybe the Bloc, the Conservatives and the Liberals voted for it. We knew it would come back for debate, and of course that did happen, and we had that debate just a short while ago, because we knew that these two clauses would become null and void unless they were somehow continued or reintroduced by March the 1st of 2007. And in fact, on February 27th, 2007, we did have a vote on those two clauses, and quite interestingly, it was defeated. And I think that was a very important moment in the House of Commons to see that after, again, a full debate in the House by all political parties, the NDP, the Bloc, and some members of the Liberal Party, we defeated those amendments. So what we see now today, Mr. Speaker, is that the government has reintroduced, with virtually no changes or very small changes, those two same amendments dealing with investigative hearings and preventative detention. And so here we are again, certainly for the NDP, here we are for the third time now, standing to speak out against this legislation. These clauses have actually never been used. I think that they are an affront to a democratic society. I think it creates a path and a process that we don't want to see in this country. I know that whenever I've spoken in community meetings or at public hearings about security issues, more often than not, people voice their very significant concerns about the kind of legislative initiatives that have been undertaken as a result of September the 11th, and how much has changed in our society in terms of security, and how many people have been targeted, particularly from visible minorities. And I want to give tribute and pay respect to the organizations who have never given up in speaking against this kind of legislation, and this legislation in particular, whether it's at parliamentary hearings or whether it's hearings that have been organized in the community. People in this country who have remained vigilant, even in the face of sometimes a public appetite to have greater security measures. There have always been organizations like the BC Civil Liberties Association, the Canadian Bar Association, the Canadian Arab Federation, the Canadian Muslim Association, many others who have always come forward to warn and to alert us as parliamentarians about the dangers of this legislation. And I think it's very important that we remember that, because sometimes in the furor and the frenzy of what takes place when things happen and people feel threatened and they feel insecure, it's very easy for governments to play a very opportunistic role, to play on those fears and to bring in the kind of draconian legislation that we've seen with the Anti-Terrorism Act. And I think we've come to see over the passage of a number of years now that that legislation was not needed. And so it's somewhat concerning and surprising that yet again we're debating this bill, we're debating these two particular clauses, and the Conservative government, with the support of the Liberals, is prepared to reenact these amendments that have already been voted down by the House of Commons, by the Canadian Parliament. Mr. Speaker, I know that when I speak to my constituents, they're very concerned about what's taking place in this country. For example, I know that this weekend it's the 4th annual summit of the Security and Prosperity Partnership that's taking place in New Orleans, and I know that our trade critic, the member for Burnaby, New Westminster, is one of the members who is going to be participating in a very broad People's Summit, as opposed to the Leaders Summit in New Orleans, that's going to be discussing what's called the SPP, the Council of Canadians, the Canadian Energy and Paper Workers Union, CP, Steel Workers Union. Many other organizations will be heading down to New Orleans probably today to participate in the SPP People's Summit. And just as we saw at Montebello in the Leaders Summit, where the Prime Minister of Canada, the President of the US, and the President of Mexico met behind closed doors to discuss security issues and trade issues, again, that will take place in New Orleans. And I'm very glad that those members of civil society, and there's about 30 organizations that are hosting the People's Summit in New Orleans, will be there to push and to demand accountability from these leaders who are trying to further this incredible agenda, which is seeing the economic, political, cultural, and security agenda between our three countries, and the integration of Canadian society, both politically, economically, and culturally, into the United States. And I think many, many people are hugely concerned about this. And I wanted to raise this today as we're debating this bill, because I do think that they're very much related. We've seen so many different processes that we're not even barely aware of. Sometimes we get leaked information, sometimes we find things out about what's going on, but all of these processes are taking place behind closed doors. There are some people who have access. We know that business elites have access to this process. In fact, they have their own forum for raising these issues and bringing them to government. But in terms of the Canadian Parliament, people generally, or organizations, or the labor movement, civil society, they have no access to this process. And a lot of this process, in terms of the Security and Prosperity Partnership, has to do with security measures and developing a common front of security measures, a merging of the American system with the Canadian system. You know that any time you cross the border. I've had many constituents who, for no apparent reason, have experienced terrible interrogation, investigation at the border, sometimes have been refused, all under the guise of security. And it really comes back to the broadness of this bill and what it represents. And although this bill has very specific measures in it, to me, C-36 and S-3, the one that we're debating today, they exemplify this this environment of heightened security, of control by the state, of the clampdown on civil society, the clampdown on individual rights and liberties. And this is something that we should really stand up against. And I'm very proud that in the NDP, not only have we done that historically, whether it was on the War Measures Act in Quebec, whether it was during the internment of Japanese Canadians during the Second World War, there are these moments in our community, in our history, where you have to make a decision as to whether or not what is being laid down has a basis, has a merit, or whether it's actually undermining in the long run the fundamental principles of a democratic society. And I know that in the NDP, we believe that the anti-terrorism legislation did just that. It fundamentally changed Canadian society. And I think there was a feeling at the time that this really wouldn't affect many people. You know, it was somehow those people. It created an environment of them and us. And I think whenever that happens, it's a very dangerous situation. When we separate, when we identify people as a group of people as being a threat, and that's precisely what this legislation does. And I think we have to take the attitude that when civil liberties of any minority, whether it be religious, whether it be ethnic, whether it be based on sexual orientation, gender, whatever it might be, any discrimination, any singling out is not only a threat to that group, but it's something that is a threat to all people. And we have a responsibility, even if we don't feel immediately threatened, or if we don't feel we're the ones who are being targeted, we have a responsibility to speak out in the defense of civil rights and civil liberties for all people. And so I certainly feel in my community there are people who feel very strongly about that, and they're very concerned about the direction that we've taken in the last 7 years. And it was actually because of the anti-terrorism legislation that a few years ago I introduced a bill to eliminate racial profiling in Canada. And it was a very interesting experience to introduce that bill, because when I introduced it and I held a number of hearings across the country, I was quite taken aback by the response I got in different cities from people who came forward with personal experiences about having been targeted. That has always taken place. I mean, racial minorities in this country have always been targeted, but it escalated, it went off the charts after September 11. And the stories that I heard from people was that it was both random and it was both systemic. The chances of being held up at the border, particularly at airports, but also at ground crossings, greatly increased if you looked like you were a member of a community that you were Muslim, that you wore the hijab, that you were a member of a minority from the Middle East. And that became very clear in talking with people and hearing about people's experiences. And so the bill that we introduced to eliminate racial profiling has been something that's very important, and I'm very pleased to say that the bill has been reintroduced by my colleague from Burnaby Douglas, and it's now Bill C-493, and we hope it will come forward for debate in this House one day, because I think there's very strong support for that bill. We also know and had the experience in this House of what happened to Mahar Ara, the horrendous situation that one individual faced in terms of a complete denial of his basic human rights, the fact that he was sent with Canadian complicity to the U.S. and then to Syria, where he remained in jail for so long. He was tortured. And again, it was only because of the work of his wife, Munya Mazig, his family, his community, and broader civil society that issue finally came forward, and there was a public hearing. And I think it's, again, one of those moments in Canadian history where people feel that a grave injustice was done, although it's good to know that because of the public pressure, finally there was a public hearing and finally there was an apology made. But what that family went through was something that is probably none of us will understand and be able to relate to, because it was so deep and it was so grievous and so harmful. And so we must learn from that experience. And so I think in light of all of those things that have happened, here we are now in 2008, and we are debating these two clauses in this bill as to whether or not they should continue. We've already voted once that they should be defeated, that they should be left null and void as a result of the sunset clauses that came in, the date that came into effect. And I would hope in this House that we could abide by that. We've had a vote. It was taken in February 2007. The clauses were defeated by 159 to 124 members. And so I'm hoping that that might happen again this time. And the fact that the Conservative government has reintroduced these clauses and is hoping that it will go through, I'm hoping very much that there's enough expression and will and solidarity in this House from the NDP and the Bloc and maybe some members of the official opposition that we can again defeat these amendments as unnecessary. Mr. Speaker, I think when you look at our global community and Canada's part in that, when we read about what's taking place in the world today, you know, people don't want to see this kind of legislation. This legislation is not going to do anything to stop food riots. It's not going to do anything to improve food security, whether it's in Canada or whether it's around the globe. It's not going to do anything to improve the health of developing nations. It's not going to do anything to eliminate starvation and the millions of children and families that are suffering needlessly because of the incredible inequities in resource development and wealth distribution in our planet. This legislation doesn't address that issue at all. And in fact, what it does is it exacerbates a global system that is based on U.S. Domination in terms of foreign policy and the war in Iraq, certainly Canada's involvement in the war in Afghanistan. I mean, all of these things are connected, and yet if you talk to people, you know, and ask them what they're worried about, you know, and ask them what they want to see us as parliamentarians focus on, people will tell you that they want to look at legislation and programs and policies that actually improve equality and social justice in our world. They want to see us focus on those priorities of dealing with those terrible inequities that exist. And so, Mr. Speaker, I'm coming to the close of my comments today, and I'm glad that I was able to speak on this bill as I have before, and I'll speak whenever it's necessary as my colleagues in the NDP will, because we believe that we play a very important role in this House of standing up. We take our role very seriously. We come here to vote. We don't sit on our hands. We challenge what this government's agenda is. And I think we speak for a majority of Canadians who, if they had a direct vote in this, would not be supporting this legislation S3 today. So I hope that when we get to the vote, that there will be enough members of this House, as we did before, to defeat this and to recognize that these amendments are not needed, they've not been used, they're not needed, and that we should focus our attention and our priorities on the issues that Canadians really want us to in terms of building healthy, safe communities, respecting our environment, and promoting social justice in our world. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Questions and comments? Questions et commentaires. The honourable member for Northumberland, Quinte West.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I listened intently to most of the honourable member's comments with regard to the proposed legislation. And Mr. Speaker, of course, I don't have the amount of time to hit on every point that she raised, but there's one thing that I think is our responsibility in this House, and I take it as my responsibility, and it has to do with human rights, and it has to do with the right of people to be able to go to bed at night knowing that there are laws in place that protect them from people who would come to this country, who are in this country, who want to do harm to them through terrorist acts. And Mr. Speaker, one of the issues and one of the reasons why this legislation has been brought before this House is because there were concerns. There were concerns with regards to human rights, and we went to the one body in this country other than this House who deals with those issues day in and day out, and that's the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court has addressed those issues, and this legislation conforms to the concerns that the Supreme Court had with regard to the legislation. And, you know, when we talk about people who are traveling, being inconvenienced by some of the heightened regard we have for terrorism, we don't mind when we go to an airport that we have the odd bottle of hairspray that has to go in the garbage, because we know that it's done in order to protect us, because we know that there was an organized terror group in another part of this world who was going to use those types of things, conceal them in order to blow up aircraft. So that's why we're inconvenienced. And I think the vast majority of us don't necessarily like it, but we understand why it's necessary. And that's why we don't necessarily always like this type of law, but we know it's necessary to protect us so that we can continue to be a country that's respected around the world for its human rights and how we take care of our citizens. And you know, one of the other names that the Honourable mentioned was Maharar. That happened under a previous regime, the Liberal regime. We have accepted and are making all the changes that Justice O'Connor recommended. We did that almost immediately upon receipt of those recommendations. And that's been the hallmark of this government. We will continue to defend Canadians against people who would do us harm. And that's what this legislation absolutely does, Mr. Speaker.
Very well said.
The honourable member for Vancouver East.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I thank the member for his comments, and for sure we have a very different perspectives on this. You know, this bill is overkill. I mean, no one here is disputing that Canadians want to experience safety. They want to go to bed at night and not worry about a whole number of things. But there's no evidence that anything in this bill is making us safer. And in fact, on the contrary, I think you could make some very strong arguments that the purview of this bill and what it represents is actually creating a society and a global community that is now so focused on incredible security measures that it's actually fostering greater destabilization. I mean, what is security, right? Security is being safe, but security is also having enough food to eat every day. Security is having a roof over your head. I mean, those are also basic forms of security. So, I mean, I think where I would depart from the member is that I think the Conservative members, the Conservative government have this obsession with legislation that is focused on a sort of a law and order approach, that everything's going to be solved by some new either little boutique bill or a big bill like we've seen with C-26 on mandatory minimum sentences for drug crimes, and this is somehow going to answer all of the problems in our society. So there is a fundamental difference in what I'm speaking about, and I think what the member's speaking about. I certainly respect his opinion, but you know, Maharar, I don't care whether it was the previous government or this government. It happened. It happened in our country, and we all bear responsibility for what happened to Maher Arar. And I'm glad that finally there was an apology. But if we don't understand what happened, and if we're not able to link it back to this bill and how we're actually dismissing the liberties that people have and that we're taking away the due process of law, then really what have we learned? And so that's the question that I put forward, and that's why we in the NDP cannot support this legislation.
Questions et commentaires. L'honorable député.
Questions and comments. The honourable member for Beauharnois-Salaberry. I'd like to congratulate my colleague opposite on her speech and conviction and passion with which she puts forward her arguments and her party's position. And she knows full well that with respect to this bill, the Bloc Québécois and the NDP will both be voting against Bill S3. And it makes me think, Mr. Speaker, every time I see a woman stand up in the House, it reminds me how few women there are in this House. And I'd like to encourage parties to recruit more women candidates so that more women can speak here in the House, and perhaps the debate would be more enlightened or at least different. So we'd like there to be more women here in the House, and I would invite all parties to really do a good job to recruit 50% women candidates for the next election. I'd like to ask my colleague, Mr. Speaker, what bothers her the most about this bill? What affects her the most? What bugs her the most? What does she see hidden behind this bill? I'd like to hear her out on that. The honourable member for Vancouver East.
Very much, Mr. Speaker, and I think that's just about the best question and comment I've heard all day, and I would concur with the honourable member. I think if we had a majority of progressive, and I'm sure she would agree with that qualification, if we had a majority of progressive women in this House, it would be a very different place. Think of the things that would be different. We'd have childcare at the top of the agenda, and housing, and food security, and our environment, and we wouldn't be going to war. And so I very much appreciate the comments of the member from the Bloc, and I'm very happy that the Bloc will not be supporting this bill, and I think we certainly stand together on that question. And she asked a very good question: what is behind this bill? I think what's behind this bill is a political climate of fear that is created for ideological reasons. We've seen it in the United States, whether it's on drugs or whether it's on security, and we're seeing it now in our own country. And it began with the former government, and it's now being continued at a very rapid rate by the Conservative government. And I think it's all the more important then that we stand up as a voice of reason, that we stand up and, in effect, blow the whistle on this kind of legislation and point out that it is not necessary, it is overkill, and what's most important is that we respect our democratic society, we respect people's human rights, we respect the due process of law, and so I'm glad that we will be voting, and the Bloc as well, to vote against this legislation.
Questions and comments. Questions et commentaires. The honourable member for Abbotsford. Less than a minute for the question.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. It was amusing to see the NDP and the Bloc pat each other on the back for not protecting Canadians. I'm actually appalled. And I listened very carefully to the speech from the member for Vancouver East, and I noticed she said that the way you address terrorism is by having a roof over your head and by having food on the table. And quite frankly, Mr. Speaker, if she looks at the Air India disaster, she looks at the people who were accused and the one that was convicted in that tragedy, having a roof over their head and having food in their belly wasn't an issue. It was a matter of religious and political extremism. So I want to ask her, how can she, in light of the Air India disaster and the the inquiry that followed, how can she still justify not supporting some reasonable anti-terrorism measures that our Supreme Court of Canada has already provided us guidelines for, and we're complying with those guidelines?
Equal time for the honourable member for Vancouver East. That means less than a minute.
All right. Well, Mr. Speaker, I'll be very fast. I never want to cross you. So, and I think it's a very good question, Mr. Speaker. I'm not suggesting at all that where there are acts of terrorism, that we should not act in a very forthright and strong way as the state to move on that. And certainly we've seen those instances. But I think when the member uses the Air India bombing as the example, I think it begs the question, because clearly legislation is already in place to deal with that. And so it comes back to the question as to why we're debating this legislation. Why is it necessary? It is overkill. It isn't needed. There is more than adequate provision within our existing laws and criminal code to deal with acts of terrorism.
Resuming debate. Reprise du débat. Alors, nous sommes à la reprise du débat.
We're resuming debate. The Honourable Member for Beauharnois-Salaberry. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm pleased to take the floor in the context of this debate on Bill S3. I'd like to start by saying that the Bloc Québécois will be opposing this bill in principle. The Bloc Québécois has done a responsible analysis, because any legislation affecting terrorism requires, in our view, a balance between safety, which is very important, and respect for other fundamental rights. With this principle in mind, the Bloc Québécois got fully involved in the examination of the Anti-Terrorism Act and its application, and this review was provided for in the Act itself. In December 2004, from December 2004 to March 2007, the Bloc Québécois listened to witnesses, read briefs, questioned experts, representatives of civil society, and the forces of law and order. As usual, the Bloc Québécois did its work rigorously, passionately, and with professionalism. And during the review of the two specific provisions in Bill S3 by the Subcommittee on the Anti-Terrorism Act review, the Bloc Québécois made its position clear with respect to investigative hearings and recognizances with conditions. The Bloc Québécois was of the view that we needed to define or put parameters on the process of investigative hearings. To us, it's clear that this exceptional mechanism should only be used in very specific cases where it's necessary to prevent activities that entail an imminent risk of serious damage, and not in the case of acts that have already been committed. Furthermore, the Bloc Québécois firmly opposed Section 83.3, which provides for preventive arrest and bonds with conditions. This mechanism is completely pointless in our view. In the fight against terrorism, what's more, this provision could be used, in our opinion, in a way that there'd be a danger of abuse of an individual. In fact, Mr. Speaker, the Bloc Québécois finds that the interruption of dangerous terrorist activities can already be done even more effectively under the application of the criminal code, under its normal provisions, without the potential harm that preventive arrest could cause. As a result, we would recommend the abolition of this mechanism, and we won on February 27, 2007. We got our way. As usual, Mr. Speaker, the Bloc is consistent, and our stand on this issue has not changed. And these investigative hearings should only be brought back if major changes are made to them, and Bill S3 doesn't do that at all. preventive arrest has no place in Canada's justice system, given the possible consequences and the fact that other provisions in the criminal code are already there and they're just as effective. Mr. Speaker, Bill S3, an act to amend the criminal code, investigative hearing and recognizance with conditions, as you know, was introduced into the Senate on October 23, 2007. And this bill, the purpose of it is to restore two provisions of the Anti-Terrorism Act which were abolished when they were not, when the Sunset Clause was not extended or renewed. The vote on the Sunset Clause was held on February 27th, 2008, and Mr. Speaker, those clauses were not renewed. It was the will of the House. Parliamentarians voted, and the Sunset Clause was not renewed. So it's quite surprising to see this being brought back in another bill. These provisions had been debated and defeated after a debate and a vote in the House of Commons by all members of Parliament here. So let's look at what Section 8328 of the Criminal Code provided. And this had to do with investigative hearings. According to that provision, an officer of the peace could ask a judge in provincial court or superior court, after getting the prior consent of the Attorney General, to issue an order for the gathering of information. That order, if it were issued, required the individual to appear before a judge, to be questioned, and to bring anything in their possession along with them. The individual in question was allowed to retain the services of a lawyer and answer questions, and could refuse to do so if they didn't want to reveal anything that would be self-incriminating. The judge presiding over the hearing had to rule on any refusal. A person's not exempt from answering questions or from providing information on the basis that it might be incriminating. In fact, the individual quite simply lost their right to remain silent. However, no information or evidence obtained in an investigative hearing could subsequently be used, directly or indirectly, in other prosecutions except a prosecution for perjury or false testimony. So, in our opinion, investigative hearings were not useful. In fact, they were never used. In the course of an ordinary investigation, the police can already question witnesses and search for documents. So under the current legislation, that is all possible. So Bill S3, which the purpose of which is just to reintroduce the identical mechanism, the mechanism that we already refused to renew. If you look more closely at recognizances and preventive arrest in Section 83.3 of the Criminal Code, these had to do with recognizances with commissions. So with the Attorney General's prior consent, an officer of the peace who believed that a terrorist act was about to be committed and who felt that a person's arrest and recognizance with conditions was necessary, this police officer could bring in information before a provincial court judge. That judge could order that the individual appear before him, and a police officer could arrest a person without a warrant, a person under this procedure, and if the arrest was necessary to avert the commission of a terrorist act. So the individual detained would have to be brought before a provincial court judge within 24 hours or as soon as possible thereafter. At that point, A justification hearing would have to be held to determine whether the person should be released or detained longer. So that hearing could not be postponed except any longer than 48 hours. If the judge determined that it was unnecessary for the individual to sign a recognizance, the person would have to be released. If the judge, on the other hand, determined that the person should enter into a recognizance, that individual would be required to keep the peace and would have to comply with any other conditions imposed for a period of up to 12 months. If the individual refused to sign a bond or recognizance, the judge could order the individual imprisoned for a maximum of 12 months. So, I repeat, Mr. Speaker, this provision was never used from the time it was created right up until the time it was repealed. So it's not surprising, because police officer always could and still can use other provisions of the criminal code to arrest someone who's on the verge of committing a criminal offense. Under Section 495 of the Criminal Code, I'll quote the provision, a peace officer can arrest without warrant an individual whom he believes is on the verge of committing a criminal offense. The individual arrested is to be brought before a judge who can then impose the same conditions as under the Anti-Terrorism Act. The judge can even, Mr. Speaker, refuse bail if the judge is of the view that releasing the individual would endanger public safety. If the police feel that an individual is about to commit a terrorist act, it's because they know of a conspiracy. They know of a conspiracy probably through surveillance or wiretap evidence, observation that leads them to believe that a criminal offense is being prepared. So they have evidence of an attempt, and all they have to do is bring that information before a judge in order to arrest the person. There may be a trial, eventually, and the individual arrested can then make full answer in defense. They may be acquitted if it turns out that the suspicions were unfounded, and if the police are unable to marshal sufficient evidence to justify a conviction. So it seems obvious to us that terrorist acts would thus have been averted every bit as efficiently and effectively as under Section 83.3. However, this provision is the most likely to lead to abuse, and that's the issue that raises the most concern in the Bloc Québécois. That provision could be used to label a person, a man, a woman, as a terrorist on the basis of evidence that's not strong enough for them to be charged, and against which the person would never have been able to defend themselves fully. This could prevent a person from traveling by plane, from crossing the U.S. border, and probably the borders of a number of countries. There's every likelihood that the person would lose their job and would be unable to find another one. So the consequences for the individual are very serious. This situation could be compared to that of Maher Arar when he came back from Syria before he was exonerated by Justice O'Connor. If this provision were to be used, it's a new and temporary provision, then there would be a court decision to impose conditions in order to avert an apprehended terrorist offense. To the general public, that individual would probably be thought, if not definitely thought, to be a terrorist. Terrorists often stem from a profound sense of injustice, and the fight against injustice is often waged by people who want to use democratic means to avoid these injustices. These people want to make positive change to the societies we live in today. And they want respect for the rights we enjoy. In politics, Mr. Speaker, obviously there are contacts between terrorists and non-terrorists. Very often, non-terrorists don't even know that they're dealing with terrorists, because when people plan terrorist acts, obviously they do so secretly. In order to determine whether an individual might be linked to a terrorist network, the intelligence officers and police observe a person, they see who they associate with, and then in order to determine whether a person should be incarcerated or subject to conditions upon release, a judge just had to be satisfied that the person's detention would be necessary so as not to undermine the public confidence in the administration of justice, given all the circumstances, including the fact that the police officer's grounds appear to be founded, and given the gravity of any terrorist offense that might be carried out. Other words, basically, Mr. Speaker, if there's a fear that there might be a serious terrorist act, they can intervene if the fears appear to be well-founded, if the suspicions appear to be well-founded. A person may be arrested if their arrest is necessary to avoid a terrorist act, to prevent it from being carried out. Now, there's a very important nuance here that's very worrisome. This provision could apply to innocent people who are unaware of the reasons for terrorists seeking their help, because terrorists may ask for help from innocent individuals without explaining to them what they're planning to do. This indicates that our criminal law, well, we already have a similar procedure in the criminal code under sections 493 and following. But the consequences of the different provisions are very different. A person could be called before a judge to answer questions under other provisions, but wouldn't necessarily have to be arrested. And a person could not be detained unless the person refused to sign a recognition, enter into a recognition to a good conduct bond. And the other provisions of the code require a person to enter into a recognizance and to respect reasonable conditions. And if the individual does this, then they can remain free, and they won't have a criminal record, and they won't be stigmatized as terrorists. There's section 83.3, which we already rejected. There's a difference in terms of the consequences and connotations. Section 83.3 is out of proportion. The consequences to the individual are grossly disproportionate. What we're trying to avoid is having our criminal justice system run roughshod over fundamental rights. And these new provisions would be a wholesale departure from what we already had. It would be not unlike the War Measures Act in the 70s, where we had a great poet, a popular singer, and family members of many people jailed merely for being related to persons of interest, and municipal authorities and so on. And because of this, that's why we didn't want this mechanism renewed. We think it's of questionable, if any, value in combating terrorism, And the use of this provision is presents a definite danger of abuse toward Canadians. A person judged dangerous can be dealt with very well and perhaps more effectively through the application of the ordinary provisions of the Criminal Code. Bill S3 is practically identical to the provisions that were repealed, the investigative hearing and recognizance with conditions procedures under 8328 and 83.3 of the Criminal Code. So,
if we include a certain number of amendments in the redrafting, in other words, if we redrafted, or if some of these parts were redrafted and if minor corrections were made, there were nevertheless only 3 substantive changes. The standardization of the procedure, the former investigative mechanism, distinguished between an act that had already been committed or was about to be committed. If the offense had not yet been committed, the judge had to be convinced that criteria other than reasonable efforts were used. It's with regret that I must interrupt the Honourable Member for Beauharnois-Celebury. The Honourable Member for Vancouver East is rising on a point of order.
Very sorry to interrupt the member in the last moment of her speech, but keeping my eye on the clock, Mr. Speaker, I believe you will find unanimous consent for the following motion, that notwithstanding any standing order or usual practice of the House between noon and 2 p.m. on Monday, April 28th, the Chair shall not receive any quorum calls, dilatory motions, or requests for unanimous consent.
Does the honourable member have the unanimous consent of the House to move the motion? La Chambre a entendu les noms.
As are the terms of the motion, is it the pleasure of the House to adopt the motion? Carried.
Comme il est 13h30.
It being 1:30, the House will now proceed to the consideration of private members' business according to the order on today's order paper. And when we return to the study of Bill S3, the honourable member will have 10 minutes of questions and comments remaining. Orders of the day. Private members' business. Second reading debate of Bill C-521, an act to provide for the transfer of the surplus in the employment insurance account in the name of Mr. Lemay. The honourable member for Abitibi-Témiscamingue is not in the House to move this bill according to the order in today's order paper, and according to the notice, therefore, the bill falls to the bottom of the order of priority on the order paper.
Stands adjourned until Monday, April 28th at 11 a.m. pursuant to Standing Orders 28.2 and 24.1.